A priest opens the door, saying someone was there. Then, he approaches the other, saying that the place was no longer safe and everyone needed to escape. The other priest asks who he was, and the man responds by asking if he hadn't heard the rumors. It was Lycan Slaughterer, the vampire killer and master of the blue demons, who was coming there with the undead. He wasn't planning to let the Black Order escape, and soon Lycan arrives at the gate. The undead kill the priest, saying Lycan wouldn't let them live and would kill them cruelly. The chief priest asks why there was so much fear of him. After all, they had the best holy knights there. But the subordinate priest says the knights the chief was referring to were the ones turned into zombies and were heading their way. Lycan then orders them to go in advance. This makes his army of undead prepare to attack. The zombies scream before charging. This greatly terrifies the priests. A glass shatters, creating an opening for the zombie army to advance. The zombies seize the priests, killing them as they scream for mercy. The priest asks how this was possible, as the undead were monsters serving necromancers. Lycan steps on the priest's hand. The priest says that no matter how hard he tried to stop them, God would save them and ensure their salvation. But Lycan points a weapon at his head and asks about salvation, releasing an energy while saying he would handle that for him. The priest notices the energy was draining his skin. Then, Lycan fires and says God's blessing would take him to hell. In front of the castle, workers discuss rumors of the exiled 7th prince, a blasphemy to the Holy Emperor, questioning how he could have been born human, saying he was beneath humanity and without rules. A lock clicks shut as one of them questions what happened to the archbishop. The girl explains the incident occurred because the archbishop's daughter got into trouble, saying it would have been better if they had just accepted the punishment. However, he had made a mess in the archbishop's quarters, calling him a slave of Gaia. This had driven the emperor mad, or rather, furious. Thus, he sent the prince to the land of the dead spirits. The emperor had sent him there to reflect on his actions, but he did disgraceful things and ended up in the afterlife after being rejected by a girl. However, he miraculously survived, falling off his chair. The strange thing was that the prince had become a different person afterward, as he worked hard in the monastery without causing any trouble. Everyone in the town became obsessed with him, though most people suspected he had changed because of the blue, with rumors that a demon had entered his body due to blasphemy, or that he had made a pact. Lycan then asks what people thought about it. Facing the undead, the boy merely watches them. A system screen declares he is Alan Alfalls, 16 years old, the exiled 7th prince of the Necromancer class. Alan closes the system and questions why it appears randomly, thinking they were there because of the people's rumors about zombies roaming around. And if this continues, he will be falsely accused of heresy, since he wasn't Alan Alfalls but a person from Korea who randomly became the useless grandson of the Holy Emperor, entering this body with a noose around his neck. However, he could see a status window that displayed the 2 zombies, and Alan says he had the necromancy skill, so he used it as a gravedigger, and that was labeled heresy here. He was initially confused but started getting the hang of it, and could stop doing this. Alan says they worked well together, as he watches the zombie digging graves. A zombie covers a body 7 feet underground, finishing the task by placing a gravestone atop the tomb. Alan says it had been a beautiful day, and the zombies agree with some strange noises. However, Alan says it was time to say their goodbyes. The zombies appear angry, and Alan tells them to calm down. One zombie is foaming at the mouth, looking rebellious. Alan says he was trying to explain it was complicated in his first life, but he wanted to see his second life in peace. He would think better about it as he approaches the zombies, placing the shovel on the ground and asking if it was fine, which the zombies confirm. Alan says he would start working, and thus the sun gleams on the church's cross. Gravediggers ask each other if they had heard something, but the cart driver with 2 bodies tells them to stop talking and pull, questioning whether he wanted to leave like they did. Therefore, they should prepare and go to the prince, and ask him to help with the curse that was devastating the village. A boy peeks his red eyes through the door, trying to observe the outside. Alan asks if those were the last bodies, and he is told that they were and seemed to be the only ones left. However, one of the gravediggers asks if Alan could go to the village, and the boy asks why. Thus, the gravediggers explain that the village was being annihilated and they would be safer with a prince, but Alan reflects that it was a powerless prince. Nevertheless, his subordinates embrace him and plead, asking him to come with them, questioning what would happen if they got sick and whether they would be safe by his side. Alan reflects that there might be a misunderstanding here, wondering what he should do. Meanwhile, in the village, Alan steps into a puddle, saying it seemed frightening, and the gravediggers say that the rain created several puddles, so he should be careful. Alan orders them to step back, but the gravedigger says they should carry amulets on their bodies. The boy says that if it were him, he would spend his time searching one more house, but they hear a noise, and everyone wonders what happened. Alan goes to check what happened, which impresses his subordinates, who plead with him not to go. However, the boy says he didn't feel good about it, and was sure there was something, as there was a murderous aura there. Thus, he notices a sneeze behind him. It was a small rat in a hole in front of the prince. Alan wonders what that was, for it was just a rat, but this one had a completely distorted look. However, a swarm of rats appears behind him, making noise, and they advance against Alan. Alan asks what the hell that was, as the rats try to bite him, noticing that they were zombie rats, which get into the boy's clothes. Alan hits them with the shovel and says they were the reason the village ended up this way. Then he uses magic on his shovel, making it hit the ground and slamming it down. The rats fall to the ground after this and gradually back away, but Alan's face cloth comes loose. Thus, the rats begin to move away from Alan, but Alan screams, saying it wasn't intentional, as the rats advance on him. The rodents knock down the prince, and his shovel falls into a puddle of water, stopping at the bottom of the puddle. However, it begins to scream as the prince tells them to stop attacking him, touching the water and activating an ability, while asking if the rats wanted to kill him. Alan controls the water unconsciously and lifts some rats, using a magic called Death Swamp. The water starts to drop, and the gravediggers look for the prince, who wonders about the magic. However, the gravediggers notice that the dirty water had become clean and ask if the prince had done that. Alan reflects that he had only used the abilities on other zombies, but he had also used a Necromancer and Purification ability, as his body was full of sacred power thanks to being the Emperor's grandson. Thus, his ability became holy. A girl tries to talk to the prince. The gravediggers say they thought everyone was dead, but there was a child, whose name was Charlotte. One of the gravediggers calls Charlotte closer, asking where her relatives were, and if the girl was okay. But Charlotte was holding a cleaver behind her back, leaping from her spot and striking the two gravediggers, standing in front of the prince. Alan defends against the cleaver with his shovel, and wonders what that was and whether she was a zombie girl, as his shovel was nearly being cut. Thus, Alan backs away and reflects that, since she was using equipment, she wasn't a zombie. Or rather, not entirely a zombie. The girl begins to grunt some noises while tearing up, calling for her father and mother and questioning where they were. Alan lets out a sound of disapproval. Thus, he defends against the girl's blow again, using his shovel. The shovel begins to emanate a bluish glow as it's close to breaking, and this glow prevents the girl from piercing Alan. He notices that, when it came into contact with sacred power, the bodies burned. However, this would keep hurting her if she kept attacking. Alan presses the shovel against the girl, knocking her into the purified water. Charlotte begins to grunt and resist. Alan tells her to resist because he couldn't think of another way, but Charlotte begins to reject the water and thrash around, thus slowly drowning in the sacred water. Alan finds himself gasping after all the physical confrontation with the girl, and Charlotte was lying in the water tearing up, closing her eyes slowly. People ask the prince if he purified rats and saved Charlotte, requesting his help, but he denies it, saying he never saved anyone. The villagers question this, and Alan closes his book, saying the girl had died. The villagers ask if she was truly dead. Alan asks how he could save someone since his blood was only connected to the emperor but held no special abilities. The villagers complain, asking what they should do about their village as they pray every day for help from someone. Alan merely sighs while listening to this plea, asking where they heard about saving lives, but they are interrupted by a servant searching for the prince. The servant then says Charlotte had woken up, and all of it was thanks to the prince, as he had only put her to sleep because she seemed tired. The villagers glare angrily at the prince, who had denied their requests, and Alan complains, saying it didn't matter, claiming he only had more divine power than those people, pointing upward and saying, however, there were certain conditions. A status window opens, stating that Parlock was 75 years old, enjoyed farming, and was filled with suspicion. Alan notes that this was interesting because he could see everything. He says Parlock had requested his help but thought of him as a useless prince. Alan mentions he had a simple condition, explaining he didn't want to do volunteer work, and would require money and supplies in exchange for helping the village. He also requests the cathedral be restored for free, and the villagers ask if he meant the entire place. Alan states it was the price for their lives and tries to blackmail the villagers, but they accept soon after. The boy adds that there was one more important thing, and the villagers are surprised by his demands, explaining that this deal should remain hidden from the holy knights. The villagers bid farewell, and Alan reflects that the cathedral would finally become a useful place. As they had said, the 30 corpses in the village had turned into zombies, making it manageable. Alan gathers his supplies at the cathedral, grabbing his shovel and asking if the people would leave him to fight alone, saying they could help while he offered a sacred prayer. The people call Alan a demon, but one of the villagers hears a growl from the window, looks at it, and screams that the zombies had followed them. They flee and tell others to grab equipment from storage, while one of them orders Alan to move his shovel if he had one. The zombies formed a massive horde, with their feet injured from walking toward the cathedral. They were maddened, and the people wonder about the state of these 30 bodies. Alan calls out to the chief, who is in the crowd, but Perron says he can't see while running, which frustrates Alan, as the other villagers fight the zombies. Alan is in the middle of the crowd facing the zombies, and he strikes one with his shovel, then uses a skill on the shovel to invoke divine water, killing many zombies with the death swamp. Alan observes this coldly. The boy remembers that using the skill wasn't the hard part since he had been a necromancer before arriving in that world, as he had volunteered in virtual reality games and conducted tests, choosing the necromancer class in that world. However, he had unfortunately died from electrocution. He lost consciousness after using his skill and then woke up in Alan's body, but fortunately, his gaming skills had transferred as well. However, the divine power in his body had altered his abilities, making it difficult to control, as every time he used a skill, his divine power would simply surge out. Wondering if this was fixable, one of the villagers shouts that he can't take it anymore because, even knowing they were zombies, he saw his wife among them. Wondering how he could kill this woman, who was the zombie approaching him. The zombie touches the man's face while growling, but she moves to bite him fiercely. However, she is interrupted by Alan, who kicks her, sending her flying away, and the villager calls her dear. Alan says they were already dead and the man should stop acting like that, but the villager claims he doesn't understand anything. Alan then tells him to look at this, pointing his shovel at the zombie wife, explaining her body was wandering soulless, and if he wanted his wife to keep suffering, he should run, but if not, he should stop crying and kill her. Meanwhile, zombies surround Alan. The boy dodges one zombie's attack, only to face another, noticing something with his blue eyes. It was someone floating above the zombies. Charlotte crashes to the ground, throwing the zombies away, breaking part of the ground with the strike. The girl stands up while the zombies are injured, and she asks if the prince was okay after that blow. Autumn and winter had been the seasons of the plague, and she believed this was only happening so they could have good health next year. Charlotte had believed what her mother told her while calling for her parents. But when she opened the door, she warned that there were several rats outside, and she looked at her father, saying they all had red eyes. However, the scene before her eyes was her own father devouring her mother. Charlotte's mother begged her to run because something strange was happening to her father. Charlotte approached her mother, calling out to her, but her father's zombie only growled in response to it all. Thus, her mother had also turned into a zombie, just like her husband. Charlotte didn't remember much after that and ran, seeing rats outside and her zombified parents. The girl grabbed anything she could swing against them, and so, she killed her parents. The girl hid behind the curtain, after having killed her parents with the cleaver she had found. Charlotte had one red eye and the other normal. Noticing that the people in her village were acting strange and the rats that tried to eat her simply ignored her, Charlotte wondered if that meant she was becoming one of them. But it didn't matter because there was no one to save her. The girl cried, begging that, if there was anyone, they would save her. And so, when Alan drowned her in the sanctified water, she began to see again. When the boy said he had no other way, Charlotte was finally drowning, until suddenly she woke up, finding herself gasping in a house. She wondered who that was and what those memories were. While the servant rejoiced that she had woken up, Charlotte asked where she was, and the servant said the prince ordered him to take care of her because there were zombies on the other side. Charlotte reflected on the prince and the zombies as well. Then she saw through the window the prince telling a villager to stop crying and go kill. When they tried to warn the prince about what was behind him, Charlotte thought someone had helped her. She banged on the window in the room, and opened it right after. The servant told her to stop and asked what she was doing, but Charlotte simply jumped out of the window toward the prince, heading toward the zombies surrounding the prince, and striking the ground hard. Standing up immediately after, Charlotte asked if the prince was okay, and facing him, she said she would save the one who saved her. Alan said there was no way, and he questioned how she had done all of that alone, gathering a pile of zombies. The villagers tossed Charlotte into the air, and Alan thought they should adore her more. Thus, he sighed and reflected that he had stopped her from becoming a zombie, making something happen for the girl. Then, he approached, reflecting that he didn't know what his abilities did, saying they should stop and take care of their remaining family members, because he knew everyone was tired and it was better to leave that place, and the zombies were in pain and had been freed from it. Therefore, Alan would perform a purification ritual for the zombies. The ritual was entirely simple. He would hold a funeral for the dead and wish them peace. Thus, the spirits would remain around him and rest. Alan recalled that this was part of the reason he had been exiled, because the land of the dead spirits had a high chance of zombies naturally being born, and someone needed to take care of it. Alan looked at the sky and reflected that, considering all of this, it still seemed entirely normal, because he had never seen an instance of so many villages being harmed so quickly all at once. However, it was far too early for the wave of death to reach that place. Alan called for Peyron, who answered him. The boy asked if everything was fine in the village or if there was anything strange, but the chief denied it. Peyron said the plague had started about a month ago as well, and Alan said it seemed intentional. Alan asked about a necromancer, which frightened everyone present. The villagers asked about necromancers, but Alan denied everything. One of the villagers said someone like that was horrible, and Alan covered his ears, apologizing for seeming horrible. However, if his theory was correct, someone had been controlling the zombies earlier, but he didn't know how to find that person. Alan said it didn't matter, and he was going to sleep, telling the villagers to rest, and they simply agreed. One of the staff asked what that meant for the prince, as he was just a worker, and they stood in front of the boy's bed. Alan lies on his bed, sighing. He reflects that he should rest, as the ritual was exhausting. He wakes up in the morning to a scream. Alan opens the window and asks what is happening as someone yells about a kidnapping, saying a zombie had abducted someone. The villagers claim they saw it with their own eyes and that it happened during their last chance to rest, as everyone was exhausted from working at night. They heard a scream and wondered what had happened, seeing Morian being taken by the zombies and crying for help. Alan asks who Morian is, and a villager explains that she's the young lady who grows herbs. She usually helps the villagers and takes care of the injured. Alan questions if the villager knows her well. He starts sweating nervously and says she's beautiful. But she's also the one who rejected the prince's confession, which makes Alan reflect on how this was happening again. Because of that humiliation, the prince had tried something reckless, but Alan interrupts them, saying he remembers now. The villagers declare they will form a search party to find her, and Alan reflects that these people were more proactive because she was attractive. Still, he decides to go there to check, as it's his first time seeing a zombie kidnap a human, and he needs to confirm it. Alan asks if the search is feasible, and the villager says Mr. Hans could help them. The prince states they will leave immediately, and the villagers agree. Alan orders them to summon Hans quickly, but he notices Charlotte watching him. Charlotte approaches the prince. Alan wonders if she's seeking revenge for him knocking her out earlier, but he decides to tell the villagers to hurry, as she could become zombie bait if they took too long. Charlotte silently watches them flee. Hans mentions that the zombies had been walking toward that area, so it was easy to track their movements. He is certain they are in the cave. Alan tells Hans he did a good job, and the villagers remark that it's no surprise. The prince reflects that Hans had tracked them well, as the cave was filled with demonic energy and likely packed with zombies or serving as the plague's source. Judging by the zombies' actions, there's a high chance someone is controlling them. Alan questions if they could burn the whole place down, and the villager asks if Morian is still inside. The prince says the place is too dark, and the undead are too strong, so if everyone tries to save just one girl, they'll become a buffet for the zombies. But the villagers ask how they could rescue her. Alan says they will prepare and return, though the chances of Morian being alive diminish. Suddenly, they hear a zombie's growl, and Alan turns around. It's a zombie bear behind the prince, biting him and causing the villagers to charge at the bear. Alan struggles to free himself from the bite, but he is dragged deeper into the cave. Alan notices that the bear is also a zombie and is thrown off a cliff inside the cave. The boy swings his shovel, using a skill afterward, activating the swamp of death and burning the bear slightly. Alan touches his own wound and uses a skill, called Terrible Curse, which begins healing his skin. However, as expected, it's a healing skill, and his divine power surges out. In moments like this, it's convenient to have reversed skills. The bear stomps the ground again, targeting Alan. It is the Gluttony King, specializing in crushing and defeating, enhanced by a Necromancer. Alan notes it's no wonder it's still standing after being hit with holy water, and it's troublesome being controlled by a Necromancer. The boy wonders how he can defeat a bear with sheer brute force. The bear charges at him, but Alan dodges the bite. The bear attempts to slash him again with its claws, but Charlotte interrupts the attack, stabbing the bear's eye. Drops of blood begin to fall from the bear's eye, yet it rises even after this attack. Alan wonders how Charlotte followed him but says it doesn't matter now. He asks Charlotte to hold off the bear, and she tries, but she is thrown back by the bear, which attempts to crush her with its paw, though she rolls to the side. The bear charges in to bite. Charlotte stabs the bear inside its mouth with her knife, causing blood to gush from the bear's mouth. The bear is thrown away afterward. Charlotte is amazed by her strike, but Alan says he was buying time to use his skill, and Charlotte tries to thank him, only to notice it's a zombie's hand. Charlotte wonders if he had been bitten by the zombie bear. Several zombies rise from the ground, and Alan says that, as expected, this was how she would fight this battle. Charlotte is surprised by the zombies rising, but Alan smiles. And so, the zombies advance, with him saying he had no chance against these numbers. One of the zombies bites the bear. They all begin to surround the giant zombie bear, while attacking with bites. The bear tries to escape with its bleeding eye, striking a zombie with its claw, and throwing others against the wall. But another zombie emerges from the ground and grabs the zombie bear's leg, with several others appearing shortly after. Alan reflects that the bear had killed many people, and he could summon many zombies. But the bear's durability was greater than that of the zombies. However, that didn't matter in the end. The bear was completely wounded after the attacks. It tries to approach Alan in its final moments, thus spitting blood near the boy, after being hit by the cleaver on the head. Charlotte looks at the bear with disdain. Alan reflects that the result of this fight was already quite obvious. Charlotte calls her prince and holds him, saying she will help him, but Alan says he had used too much divine power. The bear was on the ground, and Alan wonders why Charlotte was there and if she had gone there to fight him. Alan calls Charlotte and says it happened that he showed all his power, asking her to keep it a secret because he wanted to live quietly while in exile. Charlotte calls the prince in awe. Alan reflects for her not to bother him and leave him alone. Charlotte says the prince was the savior of her life and would fulfill all his desires, but Alan questions that. However, they are interrupted by a group of people. It was Hans and the villagers, who ask why Charlotte jumped there and if the prince was okay. Thus, they throw a rope while Alan reflects that they should leave. Hans asks who had done that to the zombies and the bears, and if the two of them had done it since he was the king of gluttony and had killed many people. Alan says he thought this was a necromancer's cave, because a necromancer tried to turn this cave into their base and killed that bear, so all the dead were already there. The villagers say it makes sense, and Alan reflects that they were too simple to suspect. However, the girl named Morian was probably already dead, because the necromancer tried to trick them by using Morian as bait, with the bear killing more people. Hans asks what they would do now, and Alan says they would move forward. The boy asks if the prince was sure, and he agrees. Alan says he needed to see how incredible this necromancer was in person. However, everyone seemed fine, so they should go. A bit of water drips from a stalactite, thus splashing into a puddle of water. Alan and the villagers notice this. Hans warns that there was something there for the prince, and they notice Morian tied up with several papers on the ground. The villagers go to her and say they were there to save her. Alan reflects that the necromancer used her as bait, so it would be easier to kill her and take control. However, they look at the girl. Morian calls the prince for a moment and asks if they all came there just to save her, but Alan slaps Morian's face, hurting her and causing the girl to spit blood. All the villagers are shocked by Alan's action and ask what the prince was doing. Alan says he should have hit her with the sharp side and apologizes. The villagers rush to help Morian, and Hans asks what was wrong with the prince. Alan says he could see everything, noticing that Morian was actually Morgana, 63 years old, a necromancer lying on the ground. The prince realizes that Morian wasn't the bait, and Morian calls the prince, saying it was a misunderstanding, but Alan says he won't listen to her anymore, and no one will fall for her, declaring that she was the necromancer. And everything, from Morian's name to her age, was a lie, which surprises the witch. Morian says the necromancer had brought her there and tortured her. Alan asks if she thought people would believe her just for being kind before, and he grabs holy water, saying it was a sacred drink. However, if she was a necromancer, her organs would fall to the ground, but it was the best cure for humans and would heal her wounds. Morian says he didn't need to give something so precious like that, but Alan says it really was precious. Approaching Morian and ordering her to drink the holy water. Morian wonders how this had happened because her disguise was completely perfect. No one suspected that she had acted as Morian for a year, so she wonders how the prince discovered it, and what kind of power this prince possessed, or if that power allowed him to defeat the bear. But Alan asks if she was going to stop drinking, since the prince was offering it to her, and she should accept it willingly. But Morian says, however, she was going to kill him during the death wave anyway, hitting the prince's hand and shattering the holy water. With skeletons rising from the ground, she says he had tempted his fate with the afterlife, as she had tried to keep him alive for much longer. However, the prince had come to her, and would meet his end there. Alan simply strikes one of the skeletons on the head with his shovel, and asks who allowed her to act arrogantly in front of him, commanding the skeleton to return to the ground because he was being kind. Morian wonders what was happening while Charlotte moves behind her, knocking the necromancer to the ground. Alan says Charlotte did a good job, and Morgana asks what was going on, asking how he did that to her skeletons and if the shovel was the source of his power. But Alan says his shovel had been incredible lately. Morgana says it wasn't an ordinary shovel but a sacred relic, but Alan asks if she's serious about that, instead of worrying about herself, while Charlotte holds a knife to her neck. After being captured, Morgana says she's 63 years old and a necromancer, now in their custody. Alan asks if she's going to confess everything while the villagers are shocked. Morgana says she will reveal who sent her to kill the prince, so he must not kill her. Alan asks if someone truly sent her. Morian explains that she was forced to seduce the prince and drive him to the afterlife. This surprises Alan, who reflects that he didn't commit anything, but was coerced. Thus, he appeared truly pathetic. Morian reflects that Alan seemed indifferent, but starts sweating nervously in front of him, saying the Dark Church ordered the death of the 7th grandson of the Holy Emperor, because they claimed he was also a necromancer and, if he found the church, they wouldn't let him leave easily. Alan questions if she had seen it, then orders Charlotte to kill the necromancer. Morgana pleads, saying it was a slip of her tongue and she would keep it secret, offering to reveal everything about the Dark Church. Alan strikes Morgana and says if she would reveal so easily, her words were worthless, because the villagers would decide her fate. After all, these people had lost family members because of her, so Morgana would pay for her sins. Morgana begs for mercy, and Alan asks Hans what they should do with her. But the hunter says she would face punishment equal to her crimes, as she would have a painful farewell and be thrown into the forest. There, animals would consume her body, and her remains would turn into a zombie, for there was nothing more insulting than a dead necromancer. Alan agrees and reflects that this was expected in a medieval era. Then he looks outside, thinking about the dark church. Alan picks up several books, and says he managed to steal all the necromancy books, storing them in his inventory. Alan reflects that it would be good if he could talk to spirits, so he touches a book, intending to read it. Alan reflects that, now that he thinks about it, Morgana had mentioned something about the death wave or something similar, so he should read about the death wave and the assassination again, wondering if his fellow princes were behind it, because as long as he was a prince, they might try to kill him due to the succession battle. Then he closes the book and says it was a fight for power, and he wonders how complicated royal family life is and what would happen if he died. For now, he should quickly increase his skill proficiency. Charlotte, who was spying, wonders if His Highness would be assassinated, because everyone said His Highness had changed. He was similar in size to her, but he always took the initiative in fighting, and saved many people during the incident alone, helping with their funerals. Charlotte recalls a villager saying that while the girl slept, His Highness had cared for her parents' bodies. The girl cries after hearing this from the villager. Charlotte says Alan is her father and her savior, and she wants to approach him to thank him, but it's not enough, because there's danger surrounding the prince, and he needs a shield to protect him. Charlotte picks up a book on imperial swordsmanship and says that, in this case, regarding the order to protect the prince, she needed to become much stronger. However, her great prince was cleaning a window. Zombies evolve over time. When their zombie bodies fall apart, they become skeletons. However, if they keep their bodies intact, they turn into ghouls. From ghoul to Dullahan, to vampire, the more they evolve, the stronger and more intelligent they become. When zombies are in darkness, the mana in their bodies evolves rapidly, which is why they possess strong mana. Because this is the fate of all zombies, called the land of dead spirits. To avoid decomposition, zombies migrate to cold and dark lands, reaching their peak at the beginning of winter. This is called the Death Wave, and on December 25th, the coldest day marked by the defeat of Amon, King of the Dead, is when the largest number of the dead attack the living. Therefore, they had only 1 month until the Death Wave. Alan notes that the witch was planning to use the zombies to kill him, but he is called by Charlotte, who says she will help him put the book back in place. Alan agrees and hands her the book. The boy reflects that he hadn't asked her, yet she kept coming to the church every day, and not only organizing books but also cleaning and preparing food without payment. Alan reflects that she would probably leave when she was satisfied. And from what he heard, she had been accepted by Grill as his adopted daughter, so she had a home to return to. Grill seemed sloppy but was a nice guy. A step is heard at the church. It was 3 of the holy knights. They look at the prince, and approach Alan, asking what happened. Seeing that one of them was Harmon Dien, the vice-commander of the knights, who said he had heard that Alan had captured the witch Morgana. Alan reflects that he went straight to the point without greeting him, treating him as an exiled prince. And considering the news he had heard, those were the bastards keeping an eye on Alan. Alan says they were right and that he captured her along with the villagers, but Harmon says he was only confirming the facts, because he had fought well alongside the villagers, and killed the king of gluttony with farming tools. When a man named Grill killed 30 zombies and poured holy water on the witch, Harmon says the farmer had told him that, and Alan reflects that he had praised him less than 5 minutes ago. The knight says he thought it was an exaggeration. However, after seeing the battlefield traces, the farmer had told the truth, and Alan reflects that if he were a holy knight, he couldn't be that naive. Harmon asks if Alan knew that Morgana belonged to the Black Church, and the boy says he had heard of it, but Morgana kept something that was public knowledge a secret. Harmon says it's because they are a vicious organization, and before, Morgana had devastated 5 villages all by herself. Alan reflects that he didn't know that. Harmon asks if they had completely eliminated her, and Alan says she was killed, and her body was gone. The knight asks if he was the one who did it, but Alan asks if he had that much strength. However, he reflects that it's true, but it wasn't good to reveal all his power, as the villagers had helped, and he should let Grill bluff. Alan says he was just there, but he got so scared he almost wet his pants. Alan notices the knight's expressions of disgust. Harmon says he didn't know about the witch's books, but Alan asks what books he's referring to. The knight says they were books of dark magic. Alan had been the one who took the books but pretends he hadn't, and says the villagers might have burned the books because they were threatening. Harmon takes out a pouch of coins and says, last but not least, Morgana's bounty was 80 coins, and there was a reward for her head. Alan says he only did what he had to do. Harmon tells him to distribute it among the villagers, and Alan agrees. Alan takes the pouch of coins and begins to appreciate it. Harmon says he hadn't finished his work and addresses His Highness, telling him to pack his things. Alan asks why, since he was exiled, but Harmon says the death wave was near, and they would escort him out of exile. The prince wonders if they care about him being a prince. Alan asks if, when they evacuate, they will send him back to the Imperial Palace or the southern island, but Harmon denies it, saying he will go with them to the state of Lonia. Alan says it's midday there, and they will still be in the land of the dead, so he asks what's the point of evacuating. Harmon explains that the kingdom of Lonia serves as a barrier to face the death wave. Under the order to fight against the zombies, they stationed soldiers and prisoners. Harmon mentions there would be many casualties and asks the prince to oversee the funerals in Lonia. Alan then thinks about the zombies invading the region. Genid Lapon, the feudal lord of Lonia, asks how Alan is feeling. Alan replies that he is not well. Genid asks if the journey was rough, and Alan agrees, mentioning that the carriage was uncomfortable. The lord inquires about the two companions. Grill states that he's someone remarkable, and Charlotte says she's a servant. Alan reflects on how well they were treating him for an exiled prince. Alan requests they skip the conversation and instead guide him to his room, to which Janet agrees. The prince wonders how he ended up there, a place referred to as the Fortress of Sacrifice. It earned this name because it housed all the victims of the death wave and was the only castle blocking the wave. They could endure a month against the zombies and see spring after the wave. Alan asks if all the soldiers and prisoners would fight on the front lines. Harmon confirms, adding that the prince would assist in treating the wounded and conducting funerals. Alan simply says he will do it. Harmon reveals that there are 2,000 to 3,000 casualties annually. Alan asks if anyone will assist him, and Harmon explains that there are 80 priests to perform the purification rituals. Additionally, soldiers would help with the funerals, so there's no need to worry, although some men die from exhaustion due to overwork. But it's manageable. Alan stomps his foot on the ground, calling for the feudal lord, who responds. Alan shouts that he wants drinks, claiming that without them, he couldn't handle the situation and would rather drink himself to death than work so hard, telling Charlotte and Grill to find entertainment as well, but to return before the death wave begins, as Charlotte must protect him. Alan locks himself in the room, saying he's going to rest. Charlotte reflects that the prince trusts her, and Harmon comments that the prince is immature. Inside his room, Alan thinks his acting was convincing, and he had no intention of drinking. Instead, he purifies the wine, gradually transforming it into holy water, until it becomes completely pure. Alan lifts the bottle and decides he should stock up on holy water, considering it his energy drink. He notes that maintaining the water's energy this way could help control his power, until he notices something on the wall. Alan places the bottles on the table, and sees a rifle hanging on the wall, recognizing it as a weapon. Alan reflects that he had read about guns existing in this world, but he didn't know they were so common, since no one in particular used them. The reason was that people preferred melee weapons. This world was full of monsters, so firearms were mostly decorative. Alan picks up the rifle and notes that instead of using gunpowder, it required mana, and it could use mana or divine power, though it consumed an absurd amount. Trained mages could fire only 5 times and needed 5 minutes to manifest a mana bullet, so it was no surprise the weapon was considered outdated. He recalls that in movies, guns kill zombies with a single shot, and he notices a compartment, wondering if that's where bullets are created. Alan aims, saying he only needs to target a zombie, then fires at the wall. A system message informs him that he has manifested a bullet with divine power, surprising Alan. The bullet breaks the wall, and the system warns that divine energy is activating. Alan thinks to himself that he's in trouble for this. Harmon approaches the area. The soldiers gossip that he doesn't seem in a good mood and that he's tense because of the approaching wave. But Harmon interrupts them, asking if he should remind them to watch the prisoners instead of gossiping. The soldiers deny it, then run off from the vice commander. Harmon reflects that they weren't entirely wrong and begins to think about the 7th prince, recalling the loud noise he heard last night. But when questioned, Alan told him not to check a sensitive teenager's room. Harmon suspects Alan broke something, thinking that a jerk will always be a jerk. However, he remembers a villager mentioning how much Alan had changed after the incident, performing cemetery duties and helping fight the zombie horde, saving them. Harmon reflects that the villagers were probably saying nonsense, suspecting Alan had bribed them. He wonders how someone like Alan could have subdued a necromancer of Morgana's level, seeing that Grill was probably strong and the misunderstanding was worsening. Harmon reflects that it might be better to write a letter of recommendation for him to take an exam for the Holy Knights. But he hears a noise and wonders if the prisoners were fighting, interrupting the two and asking what they were doing before the big battle. Harmon is surprised by this, seeing a shovel pointed at the man's neck, and Alan asking if they didn't know who he was. One day after arriving in the state of Lonia, People began passing away due to the epidemic and excessive work. Alan realizes it's no surprise he's being cared for, given how much they make him work, while wearing a bird mask enchanted with a purification spell. And he asks if it hasn't been long enough, as the zombies didn't seem to be coming, until he hears someone calling him. Alan turns around, and it's people asking if he had just raised his head now, asking why he wouldn't come over and rest a bit from his duties. This was Heis Hedron, the eldest son of Count Hedron. Heis says that, judging by Alan's face, he looked like a student from the academy, but Alan doesn't know it. The Count's son asks if he came there as part of disciplinary action, and his subordinates say that children from good families can be exceptions in that, and it's obvious he's just cannon fodder. They tell Alan that if he wants to live peacefully, he should listen to Heis, as he is the eldest son of Count Hedron. Heis says that if he wasn't looking for a maid, they wouldn't have come down this path, pointing at Charlotte, saying someone like her would suffice. Alan questions about Charlotte, and Heis asks if she's his maid. Heis says that he once laid hands on such a beautiful girl at the academy. However, he claims he took care of her, but even with fear, she eventually came into his hands. Alan reflects that he would rather dig the ground than talk to these bastards, and Heis asks if he's already leaving, but Heis calls Charlotte over. The girl asks if he's talking to her, and Heis agrees, saying she's right there. Heis grabs Charlotte's hand, and tells her to go somewhere with her busy master. Charlotte refuses, saying she's busy right now, but Heis asks if she doesn't understand because he wants to play with a peasant like her. The girl squeezes Heis's hand to the point of hurting him. Alan observes the subordinates running to Heis and thinks Charlotte is about to break his hand at this point. Heis calls Charlotte a monstrosity, asking why she's so strong and should live in a remote area like this. Heis says he'll tell his parents what happened with this monstrosity like her. The boy continues speaking, saying that, as things are, everything seems fine, and considering that half of the dead turned into zombies, Charlotte's family would become zombies, but then Alan prepares to strike him with his shovel. Thus, Alan slams his shovel into the ground and almost hits Charlotte, breaking the ground in front of Heis. Heis asks what Alan had done, but the prince says he made a mistake while digging the earth. The Count's son asks how he could call that a mistake, but Alan punches him and says his hand slipped this time. Heis falls to the ground, and his subordinates go to him. The noble asks if Alan doesn't know who he is, but Alan steps on Heis's chest and asks what he knows about him, questioning if he knows who he's messing with. But he's interrupted by Harmond, telling him to stop. Harmond asks if Alan is going to cause another incident again, and Heis calls the Holy Knight. Heis yells, saying Alan hit him and should be punished, but Charlotte tries to intervene. Harmond says he can't ignore this, and Alan remains silent. Then, moving his finger, and casting a silence spell that prevents everyone from speaking there. Harmond is surprised, but notices his voice isn't coming out, meaning Alan is using holy magic enchantment. Alan calls Harmond during the enchantment, ordering him to tell Heis who he is. The tension between the two grows. Harmond addresses Alan by name, saying he is Alan Alfals, the grandson of the Holy Emperor and the 7th Prince. Alan asks if Heis understands now and questions how rude he was to his maid and his failure to show respect. Heis tries to speak about it, but Alan says he doesn't need to be scared, and that if he apologizes sincerely, there won't be major issues. However, Alan was thrown into a cell, telling Charlotte that there's a problem, and the girl says that, according to the knight, harming a noble cannot be forgiven, and Heis fainted after that. Charlotte apologizes for Alan getting a week in prison because of her, but Alan says it was thanks to Heis and that he'll kill time with books. He remarks that it's much better this way, especially with the snowstorm outside. A soldier approaches the vice commander, reporting that the prisoners had been ordered to clear the snow, but it couldn't be done quickly. However, Harmond grumbles about enchantments, reflecting that the 7th Prince could now use enchantments, something he hadn't been able to before. Previously useless, he now carried the Emperor's blood in his veins. The soldier calls for the vice commander again. Harmond responds, ordering them to continue clearing the snow around the castle until it reaches a manageable height. Looking over the wall, he comments on the intense cold, adding that there were bound to be a few zombies, and mentions that His Majesty killed the Spirit King on the 25th. The soldier asks if they should report this to the Sacred Emperor's family, and Harmond says it's the best they can do for the prisoners, ordering the soldier to sound the bell and saying they need time to regroup, opening the gate for the prisoners. However, amidst the footprints, there was a bloodied boot. A zombie had eaten one of the prisoner's legs. The soldier orders the gate to be shut. Inside the gate, they instruct the priests to tend to the prisoners quickly. The prisoners explain that the zombies attacked them from behind, and due to the storm, they couldn't tell where they were hiding, adding that the one who stayed behind was devoured. The soldiers command the group to regroup and take positions, scaling the walls to prepare for defense. Harmond remarks that he didn't expect things to be this quiet. He reflects that the day the Spirit King was killed is drawing near, and soon, the zombies will emerge. At least 3,000 are expected to attack, Harmon wonders what will happen if the zombies attack from behind, thinking they might be hiding in the snow, suppressing their instincts. Undead are dead people. They feel no fear and only follow their instincts. If improperly equipped or lacking strategies and tactics, they could overwhelm large groups of people annually. Harmon observes that, in any case, the zombies were marching, while beating drums. Harmon notices that the army is perfectly coordinated. Realizing this has never happened before, a voice from the middle of the army calls out to the living, urging them to feel fear and envy during their long farewell, declaring it natural to tremble in his presence. He claims to be the judge of this world and the Messiah who will save them by sending them to the other world, proclaiming himself the successor of Udai, the Reaper, a vampire count capable of biting, using mana, and necromancy, along with being incredibly arrogant. Alan closes his book and complains that it's too noisy outside. Remarking that it's late, they're delaying his meal, and wondering what's happening. Alan goes to the window and asks if they would let a prince starve, but someone calls out to His Highness. Janet appears, and Alan assures him he wasn't trying to break the cell, but the governor insists they leave immediately. Alan reminds him he's still being punished, but Janet says it's no longer important because a legion of undead is outside the city. The boy questions whether there aren't enough workers, but Janet clarifies that it's truly a legion, led by a vampire commanding a horde of zombies. Alan questions if Janet might be mistaken, asking if a high-level monster is really there. Janet confirms that the vampire spoke a human language and controlled other monsters. However, he's unsure how it happened, and Harmon is confronting him for now. The state is on the brink of collapse, and they must evacuate to a safer location, addressing Alan as His Highness. Janet insists on escorting him, but a tremor shakes the area, and Alan asks what the noise is. Janet explains it must be the Monster Legion, urging them to evacuate through the back gate. Alan hears a noise from above. It's several zombies charging toward them, crashing through the window, and falling into the room. Alan asks what's going on, realizing it's a conglomeration of zombies. Alan comments that they've thrown multiple zombies through the window, and the undead have infiltrated their territory. The boy reflects that if they are attacking from inside, the exterior must be swarming with them. Alan grabs his shovel and tells Janet to come to his senses and command his soldiers. As if their territory falls, everyone will become undead. Janet turns and promises to find a safe place for the territory's residents to take refuge. Alan wonders what he should do, noting that while he could hold off the zombies for a while due to their level, this time, he is entirely outnumbered. In this situation, he had no choice but to run, touching the bars, summoning the death swamp for the zombies, which begins to drive the undead insane, but then kills them and creates several puddles of sanctified water on the ground. Alan says he'll use this chance to quickly head outside, thus advancing through the hole in the wall, but witnessing the chaos outside, seeing zombies killing many people in the city and the residents crying for help. One of the residents screams that there's nowhere to run from the zombies, but the soldiers tell them to fall back immediately, as they would push the zombies back with their shields. However, the zombies were also approaching from behind them. Alan observes the entire chaotic scene from a distance, and clenches his teeth, preparing himself, reflecting that he didn't know how far he could go by creating divine water on such a large scale. But he raises his shovel, saying nothing seemed to be going right for him, as if the goddess Gaia was upset at not being able to control him, slamming his shovel into the ground, and activating the blessing in a horizontal area, creating a gigantic wave of water that envelopes the entire area with magic. The water begins to fall like rain, and Alan uses a spell to weaken the epidemic. The rain starts falling on the battlefield, soaking and burning the zombies it touches, which begin to dissolve into the ground. The soldiers ask why the zombies are dying in the rain, and the villagers notice their wounds have healed. Thus, they ask if this is divine water and not mere rain, and if they're being blessed by the goddess Gaia. But one of the villagers notices His Highness, and calls for everyone to look, saying the holy water is surrounding His Highness. Alan quickly becomes exhausted after the spell. The people ask how he could use divine power in this way, and even though he's an exiled prince, after everything, he is still the grandson of the hero who defeated the king of the dead, Amon, 50 years ago, the sacred emperor Celtic Alphals. A soldier asks if any residents need help, as their lord opened the mansion gates, and he would guide them there. The villagers rejoice and smile, clapping their hands. A woman with her child is happy to be alive and runs. All the villagers thank His Majesty for this. Alan says he should have made it rain from inside the castle because he's exhausted. Then he shouts for the soldiers to keep doing well, as they would join him to assist the holy knights outside, but the soldiers say they don't have proper weapons. Alan says the dead cannot be defeated with ordinary equipment, so he'll give them a blessing, touching their spears and saying it's his first time and he doesn't know how far they'll go, but their equipment now holds sacred power. The soldiers ask what this is, and Alan explains it will work against zombies, and they need to repay him for saving their lives, thus calling the soldiers to follow him. as they need to fight to survive. Outside, the soldiers engage in a bitter battle against the zombies, fighting with all their strength to strike them down. Thus, one soldier decapitates a zombie and splits its head in half with that strike. The soldiers say they barely touch the zombies and really have divine power in their weapons, and those zombies are nothing. Therefore, they will assist the holy knights. This way, they could win. They could win because the descendant of the hero was by their side. But a horse's hooves strike the ground. It was a Dullahan in the midst of the soldiers, who pierces one of the guards with its black lance, slashing through several with one strike. Right in front of its own companions, one of the soldiers falls to the ground, and the Dullahan approaches him. The soldier says they cannot defeat this monster while its lance is pointed at his face. But a weapon appears beside him. Alan is aiming beside the soldier, and apologizes to him as he prepares the shot, saying it's his first time using the weapon, and he's not yet familiar with it, firing at the Dullahan. Yudai could feel the energy of the living and smelled fresh flesh he hadn't noticed in 50 years in that place, and asks how it could be so fresh, wondering how strong his legion would be if he could turn them into zombies. He had been waiting for this for 50 years, from numerous zombies driven by instincts to a ghoul, from ghoul to Dullahan, and then to a zombie lord, until becoming a vampire. How long had he been waiting to be able to think and make judgments? Vampires were ranked based on the mana they possessed. However, he was not recognized by other vampires and didn't know how long it had been since he became one. Yet, he was confident because he had received power from a count, because he obtained something different. The skull of Aman, the king of the dead spirits. Thanks to this skull, he gained mana that would have taken 100 years to accumulate, in just a few decades, sustaining his legion of 20,000 zombies, which would surpass a count and rise to become a king. Thus, he had no fear of ordinary divine power, punishing the holy knights, forcing their surrender, and turning them into undead. The soldiers continuously fire their crossbows. Harmon rallies his troops, telling them not to stop pushing forward, as once the sun sets, the undead will grow stronger, and they must kill them all. If they don't fall, the village will collapse as well. While he reflects on how the zombies have already infiltrated their territory, unable to maintain command over this place, he wonders if the village is holding up. And if it isn't, he questions what will come next, as in times like these, only His Majesty, the Emperor, could prevail. Charlotte appears and says the village is fine, because His Majesty is there. This is why she protects the village since her master resides in it. Harmond is surprised by her statement, and admits she is right, while Charlotte drops the equipment from her arms. Charlotte mentions she heard that Harmon sought equipment for those stationed atop the castle, and Harmon reflects on how he thought she was just a servant. Yet even veteran soldiers couldn't carry so much equipment, leaving him to wonder how strong this young girl truly was. Harmon asks if even a child like Charlotte is working so hard, whether he has the right to act weak, and reflects that they can endure this, and, in the worst-case scenario, they will destroy this place to sever the vampire's head. A massive zombie places a heap of bodies onto a catapult. Charlotte and Harmond are shocked by this, noticing the pile of zombies being flung over the castle walls. Harmond warns of the danger, and orders Charlotte to stay behind him, invoking a skill from Heim, the god of war, pleading for strength to protect these poor souls. However, Charlotte interrupts him with her sword. Charlotte unsheathes her sword with mastery, and effortlessly slices through the heap of zombies, splitting them in two. The severed zombie pieces land inside the castle behind Harmond. He wonders how she could have done that as Charlotte lands on the ground. Harmon questions whether she truly sliced them in half, and these zombies couldn't even stand against the girl's sword, as she merely aimed her strikes or imbued divine power into her weapon to stop the undead, leaving him to ponder what in the world was happening with her swordsmanship, which cuts zombies like paper as she walks through the fields, slashing through their torsos, up to their necks with complete precision, dispatching them with swift, exact movements. Harmond observes that her techniques are crude and unpolished, as she relies on brute muscle strength due to her lack of familiarity with fencing. Charlotte cleaves a zombie with raw power, and Harmond realizes that this destructive cutting style is undoubtedly the swordsmanship of the Holy Imperial family, passed down through the Crusader Knights. Harmond calls to her from atop the wall, asking where she learned this sword style, and if she's a member of the sacred Imperial family. Charlotte denies it, stating that she's merely the servant of the 7th Prince. Even her swordsmanship was self-taught from reading a book. A silence falls between the two as Charlotte leaves, but Harmond couldn't fully comprehend what she tried to convey. A person throws supplies to the priests, advising them to heal the wounds with holy water if their divine power is depleted. Janet orders them to stop and asks where the supplies came from, but the soldier explains that His Highness had provided them, instructing that they be reserved for such an occasion. The city lord remarks on their fortune and asks where His Highness is. The soldier replies that after returning from the moonlit field outside, he left with the remaining soldiers, leaving Janet to question this decision. The man clarifies that he thought Janet had authorized it. Janet remarks that, given how everyone speaks of His Highness's personality and divine power, trusting him may not be wise, and he wonders if they could deploy a troop to the left side of their territory. Blood stains the ground within the territory, a trail of blood and discarded weapons from the battle. Soldiers move about the area, many of whom had turned into zombies. Alan moves alongside the soldiers to the top of the walls, and one of the soldiers asks who he is. The prince replies that he's the reinforcements, his face concealed by a mask. The soldier remarks on the increasing number of people and the pressure on the castle, but Alan explains that this is why he sent half his forces elsewhere. Alan reflects that, compared to this place, they had more work and couldn't check the faces. But since he was giving out holy water, he didn't have any for personal use and couldn't activate a new ability properly. Thus, he uses spectral soldiers and notices he has raised ancient dead soldiers. However, it was challenging since he had only used the bodies from the village for this, and he was doomed if they were caught, so they would cover their faces. A soldier asks if he is there to treat them and should have stayed in the rear instead of coming there, but Alan says he had things to do, drawing his weapon and saying he wanted to try using it. The soldier tries to stop him, saying it was a kind of useless ornament there, but Alan says that place had the best view of all, because he could see the leader of the zombie horde clearly, aiming at Yudai's head, but then switching his aim to the testicles, and preparing to fire his weapon, saying this would be the perfect chance to give him a taste of Gaia's blessing. Harmon asks the soldier about the battle situation, and the soldier salutes his vice commander. The vice commander says he came because he heard the territory's evacuation had been completed, and asks to let him assist as well. The soldier says, fortunately, the situation hasn't worsened, because somehow, ordinary soldiers were using equipment with divine power, and there were also some with abilities comparable to those of holy knights, with additional reinforcements arriving as well. Harmon asks what in the world happened while he was defending the castle but decides not to ask further, and the soldier says they still don't know how to face the vampire. The vice commander questions about long-range attacks, and the soldier says they tried with crossbows and arrows, aiming a crossbow forward, and shooting an arrow into the air, which advances toward the vampire's head, but it's blocked by a mana shield surrounding Yudai. The soldier says that if they imbued it with holy power or holy water, they might stand a chance, but Harmon says that would weaken against a mana shield, and asks if their only chance is to break through the Legion of the Dead and attack directly. Harmon reflects that their hands are full just holding the line now, so it's impossible, but the soldier notices something. Seeing a priest and people saying an ordinary priest couldn't do such things, while a soldier calls his commander. Thus, Harmon sees Alan's back, and notices that light, with Alan calling Gaia the goddess of love and mercy, praying for her protection for this young one and permission to use her power to cleanse the dead and strike the vampire. It was as if Gaia surrounded the boy holding the weapon. Harmon asks who in the world this is, because an image of the goddess manifested through the particles of light, a direct blessing from Gaia. Even among high-ranking priests, it's something that occurs only once in a lifetime, and he's never heard of a priest of such rank in Lonia. Charlotte approaches Harmon from behind and says that this is His Highness, because she can recognize that it's the light of His Highness. Harmon is surprised by Charlotte's admiration, and reflects that the prince who blasphemed against Gaia had received the goddess's blessing, a great contradiction. Thus, if this person really is the seventh prince, what could he have done to earn the love of the goddess Gaia? And Alan simply says it's the perfect chance to make the vampire taste Gaia's blessing, firing and saying maybe Gaia will bless his testicles. The shots pierce through all the vampires in the way, killing all who are in their path, colliding with the shield spell. Yudai tries to block the strike with his shield, which begins to fragment, but the shield is pierced, and the shot hits him, successfully striking his testicles with ease. The method of acquiring divine power was clearly explained in the Sacred Emperor's book, in the monastery, and when he noticed this while flipping through the book, Alan had seen that the method was prayer. While mages use spells and mana, priests pray and use divine power, and necromancers use lifespan and magic power to wield their abilities. So, ordinarily, he would have to sacrifice his life to gain magical power in exchange. However, he didn't need this because he had a great amount of divine power as the Sacred Emperor's grandson. Alan wonders what would happen if he could use his power without sacrificing his lifespan, so it was more useful to try praying, and thus he did. Yudai is injured by Alan's shot. He yells to his army that they should all retreat for now. Alan remarks that he worked hard because of his shield, but he had only managed to control it enough to pierce. A soldier shouts that the Legion is retreating and orders everyone to move, while Alan reflects that it was a miracle he didn't meet his end, but this gave them time to regroup. He looks at his soldiers, who were watching him from the battlefield. Alan adjusts his mask and notices their stares, asking if he should begin treating the wounded now. The soldiers say it's their first time witnessing a divine blessing and ask if he is a high-ranking priest and whether the sick will be healed. Harmon wonders if that is truly His Highness, as someone so utterly useless who was exiled could accomplish all of that in just one day. He also notices Charlotte, full of skill, yet completely dedicated to serving as the hands and feet of the 7th prince. Alan moves alongside his army of undead soldiers, and Harmon recalls everyone saying that the prince had changed, though he hadn't believed them. He remains silent for a few seconds after realizing this, wondering if Alan had truly changed after losing his memories, and whether he had forgotten the events of 5 years ago to return to his former self. He was speaking of the personality the prince had before Her Highness Elisha passed away. Elisha, the mother of the 1st and 7th princes, was a peasant girl of mixed race from the Sacred Nation and Southern Aslan, 2 regions with a history of hostility. As a result, all the priests, nobles, and even His Majesty rejected her. However, the Emperor's son loved her deeply, marrying her and giving birth to the 1st prince of the Sacred Kingdom. Despite this, the influence of the Holy Emperor's family ensured disapproval from the 2 noblewomen who were concubines of the Emperor's son. Over time, several princes and princesses were born until Elisha gave birth to the 7th prince. When the 7th prince turned 10, Princess Elisha died suddenly. She was attacked by a vampire during a nighttime walk with her 2 sons. Elisha, trying to protect the 7th prince, became a thorn in the vampire's side and died. The prince barely survived the attack, falling under a curse that weighed on his heart. The kind-hearted 7th prince was shattered by this incident. He was so traumatized that others claimed he had gone mad. Harmon wonders if someone who lost their memories after nearly dying could return to their original personality. But the fact that he regained his memories didn't change the strength of his divine power. However, even with lost memories, one couldn't maintain such strong divine power for so long. If this happened to avoid drawing attention from the sacred imperial family, it might mean the prince was plotting his revenge. Harmon reflects that he understands why the prince might do this, since the imperial palace wasn't a kind place for His Highness or the princes. Thus, it was better for the prince, and even for himself, to remain distant from the insults of the nobles. He wonders what would happen if the prince sought revenge against the nobles and the vampire responsible for his mother's death, speculating that the prince deliberately bided his time to grow stronger and distance himself from the constant survival battles of the imperial palace. Being a knight close to the royal family, Harmon could understand why the prince acted rudely in his presence. Even Charlotte, who was young yet comparable to a member of a prominent family. Harmon looks down, saddened. He regrets that Elisha didn't send the 1st prince, avoiding his current sorrow. Because no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget the past when he failed to protect Her Highness and watched the 7th prince build his revenge, remaining idle even amidst all the insults directed at the exiled prince. If the 7th prince truly wanted revenge for Her Highness, Harmon resolves that he should offer his help. But first, he needs to address the problem in Lonia. He approaches a soldier and asks if he is on patrol. The soldier doesn't respond, and Harmon asks if the wind is preventing him from hearing. Harmon notices the soldier doesn't have a torch during the night and isn't human, then charges at the zombie soldier. The 2 clash with their swords. Harmon realizes that the soldier isn't normal, as his tattered clothing reveals his undead nature. Arrows fall around Harmon, and he notices more of them nearby. However, he senses not only demonic energy, but also divine power emanating from them. Harmon strikes the undead's hand, causing its sword to fly out, and saying that, in this case, he couldn't leave an undead alone. He went to strike the zombie with his sword, but Alan appeared panting, and ordered Harmon to stop. Harmon noticed that the undead had stopped moving, and asked the prince what was going on. However, the prince asked Harmon to put his sword down. On the way, the prince asked if Harmon had organized the troops, as the legion would return, and after midnight the zombies would grow stronger, but the soldier simply called Alan, and asked if he was using necromancy. Alan remained silent at the accusation, but said he didn't know how, and reflected that now that Harmon had caught him, everything was ruined. Harmon said it wasn't that easy and asked how desperate he was to learn necromancy, but Alan denied it, saying he had summoned the dead, but after losing his memory, he couldn't remember how he learned it and thought it would help in the war. Reflecting that if he told Harmon he was transmigrated, Harmon wouldn't believe him. Harmon said he could have made a pact with a demon, but Alan asked how that could happen if the zombies had divine power, and said he wasn't hiding anything but had always been interested in necromancy. Asking Harmon if he would report it to the Inquisitors, Harmon said he certainly would, and Alan looked sad, reflecting if he would be captured and tortured. However, Harmon knelt, facing the prince on his knees, saying he wouldn't do that at all. Alan was surprised by this, while Harmon said he would help the prince to the very end. Alan reflected that he thought Harmon hated him, but now he wanted to help him, and wondered if Harmon was trying to cling to a lifeline, but he wasn't a severed rope. Alan asked if he wasn't helping him just to keep an eye on him, and Harmon questioned, but replied that he wanted to do the same as when he was a child. Alan said they should forget this for now and focus on their duties first. the moon turned red, and Alan said it was time, because they wouldn't waste their precious time with the abundant mana. Alan wished Harmon a Merry Christmas. Seeing the army of undead heading toward the castle, Alan said they also had a good Halloween bonus. Yudai shouted to all the dead that their time had come, saying they would eat the living and evolve to make everyone kings as well. Thus, Yudai prepared a type of spell to spit, firing a blast of dark energy forward. The knights ordered the soldiers to hold their line, but Heist told Genid he couldn't do it, because the side of his face where the prince hit him was hurting, and he couldn't do something so impossible. While Genid asked if this was right to do, because the monster's powers were incomparable to those from years ago, and were making the soldiers give up, asking if they could withdraw their soldiers and reorganize. But everyone noticed the priest with the raven mask in the middle of the crowd. The soldiers saluted the priest and said he would save them, while Genid questioned who this priest was. Alan called Gaia, invoking her powers, and asked for her blessing for all those who would fight, thus activating the abilities to neutralize the epidemic. The water began to surround the zombies, while helping the soldiers gain strength to fight. Genid said that was right, and that the priest had come to help them, shouting that the goddess Gaia was with them. The soldiers pierced some zombies, then cut them apart after impaling them. Thus, the battle began, and with his blade, Harmon prayed to the god of war for assistance, advancing airily against the zombies, and slamming the ground to kill them quickly. He reflected that this was the prince's chance to boost the soldiers' morale, and they couldn't lose this opportunity, as their sole objective was the zombie count observing them from afar. Yudai said that the bastard priest was constantly blocking his path, and the area hit by his sacred power was incurable, while Harmon advanced, so he couldn't hold back his rage any longer. Harmon attempted a strike against the count, imbued his sword with magic, but the vampire dodged, swiftly going after him, then stepping on one of his subordinates and killing him. Harmon ordered him to stop as Amon's skull ignited, noticing the vampire was targeting their priest. The soldiers looked up as the vampire began to transform, becoming something resembling Amon and asking who would stop him, grabbing several soldiers and saying they were arrogant to try to stop him. Alan reflected that he knew he would provoke them first, because just from how they could see the mana flow, the vampire knew about his divine power, and it was only a matter of time before he found him. Thus, the best decision was to head to a vantage point and, as planned, use the dense wall as territory. In doing so, he would make it difficult for the enemy to hold its ground against him. However, a boulder had been launched and was chasing Alan, but it was sliced in half by a strike. It was the vampire, mocking Alan for trying to stop him with mere rock throws, and ordering the priest to meet his end, unleashing an attack toward Alan. Alan shouts that he knew it was impossible and calls for Plan C, summoning Charlotte, who carries a massive boulder to hurl at the monster. The vampire continues charging his energy blast toward them, while Charlotte prepares her strike with the boulder, until the vampire's magic causes an explosion at their location. Charlotte manages to block the magic using her shield, preventing it from reaching Alan. Alan remarks that it was expected and that she's truly reliable. However, the boulder begins melting under the magic, and he notices how powerful it is, realizing the wall won't hold much longer. Charlotte's lack of control over her power means they'll soon be turned to ash by the vampire's magic. But Grill arrives to help them, supporting the boulder while calling out to Charlotte. Charlotte is surprised by her adoptive father's actions. Grill says that even though he doesn't know swordsmanship, he can still help his daughter, shocking Charlotte once more. The two hold the boulder with all their strength, trying to keep the magic at bay. But Alan asks why Grill would help them without having any power. Grill calls out to His Highness, who has risen to his feet. Alan reflects that while he couldn't use his divine power properly, if the wall were reinforced with divine energy it might work. So Alan calls on Gaia, praying for her strength to protect these poor sheep, and grant them her mercy to stop this undead being with her power. Thus, Gaia should bestow love and grace. Since he prayed, she should provide something in return. A shield forms around the boulder, impressing the demon resembling Amon, causing an explosion around the area. Debris falls to the ground after the strike. Charlotte searches for His Majesty and her adoptive father, until she notices something on the ground. It's her adoptive father, and she rushes to help him. Alan places a hand on her shoulder, saying Grill is fine and has only fainted, so she shouldn't panic. Charlotte asks about His Majesty, but Alan says he feels like he's about to collapse but is otherwise fine. The vampire screams, saying the divine power burns inside him, disfiguring him with Gaia's energy. Alan says this is their chance. Charlotte warns that the prince's body can't handle fighting any longer, but Alan responds that he knows, and this is their opportunity to retreat. Alan orders Charlotte to carry Grill, as they'll head underground. The prince reflects that his sacred power is depleting faster than expected, but he notices a skull while talking to the soldiers. He realizes the mana surrounding the vampire is similar, seeing Amon's skull discarded on the ground. Charlotte calls out to His Highness, who who says he needs to check something before leaving. Picking up the skull and questioning if this was the one the vampire wore around his neck, wondering what its purpose is. The system activates, revealing it's the skull of Amon, the Necromancer King, which boosts magic by 20% to 200% depending on recovery level. The vampire burns entirely, cursing the priest and stating he must recover quickly. However, he cannot find Amon's skull and goes berserk, spotting Alan holding it and calling him a bastard. The vampire charges at Alan, demanding he hand it over. Alan remarks that after inspecting his status window, he understands the skull's use, and decides to channel its power, boosting his divine energy and creating temporary equipment. Alan declares himself the Legion, and the heir to Gaia's legacy. The system confirms his words and releases shackles against the vampire, piercing his hands, and binding his legs as well, completely pinning the undead to the ground with 2 holy knights restraining him. Alan states that he can feel the spark of death, and calls the vampire a heretic who broke the world's rules, asking for his reason for existing, as he had only come to know him through his commands. One of the soldiers calls out to Master Alan, asking for further orders. The vampire questions what is happening, claiming he's the only one breaking the rules, accusing Alan of using divine power, and even commanding undead with egos, something he has never heard of before, because such things betrayed the will of Udai, the Reaper. However, Alan points his weapon at the vampire and says he's confused. After all, he managed to obtain good equipment for himself, and in the name of the priest and sacred power, Alan fires, wishing the vampire a Merry Christmas. The vampire is struck in the head by the shot, pierced right through the center. Alan watches him split apart from a distance, but soon becomes tired and out of breath, collapsing to the ground as the monsters dissolve. The zombies begin to disappear. Even those fighting the soldiers fade away gradually. The soldiers rejoice at this, raising their hands to celebrate as Harmon leaves the area. He turns, concerned about the prince, approaching Charlotte, who is carrying Grill and Alan in her arms. Harmon asks if he's too late. Outside, a horse approaches. One of the soldiers confirms to his lord, who responds by saying he heard about an anomaly in the land of the dead and thought the Necromancer King had been resurrected. But it seemed to be just a mere vampire performing his little trick, since he didn't realize he had accumulated 20,000 undead monsters, and Lonia consisted of prisoners and resilient people, so if the vampire tried to attack them, it showed he wasn't strong. However, this was very strange. The man reflects that the atmosphere had changed since they arrived, with traces of confrontation between magical and sacred power. Therefore, if the vampire had more magical power, the man wonders who could block it. One of the soldiers asks if it could be a saint-like devotee, but the man says it would be great if it were, because in these times, vampires had begun infiltrating among humans, and it would be easier if they had a priest or pope to assist them. A soldier explains that God left fragments to awaken divine power, so it's not easily activated, and the man responds that he knows, because he's only saying this place isn't like the palace to have such things. Then orders priests, healers, and alchemists to take care of the residents before the prisoners. One of the soldiers asks for permission from his lord, and says the 7th prince is there, and asks if his lord will meet him. But the man questions if he would really meet the 7th prince, ordering them to return to the castle while the soldier simply agrees with his order. The man says he doesn't need to see a child who dishonored his mother, and calls his grandson a cursed one, revealing himself as Emperor Celtic Alphals, 105 years old. Celtic says he bets the boy is in the hall of his mansion at this exact moment. Harmon reports that the 7th prince had just hunted the vampire. Celtic is surprised by this, and stands up, asking what happened. The nobles gossip that this is the worst joke they've heard, as they haven't heard something so bizarre in years. Celtic scratches his forehead in anger at the nobles, and asks if they're talking about the same Alan Alphals, and Harmon agrees, saying that while overseeing Lonia as part of volunteer work, he hunted the vampire. Celtic grips his throne and says the boy is pure, but if that doesn't make him, questions if he wants to kill his king and tries to insult him until he's interrupted. The archbishop says the emperor is a bit too excited today and tells Harmon that he should know, because what he said is impossible, revealing himself as Raphael Astoria, 100 years old. After all, the prince is immature and only thinks of himself, lacking common sense, so he couldn't possibly do something so significant. Harmon reflects that, as expected, siding with the 7th prince isn't an easy task. However, he wouldn't believe it either if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. Thus, Harmon says he's just reporting what he saw. The archbishop says this is also the report of the residents of Lonia defending the 7th prince. Celtic remains on his throne, listening to the entire account, and the bishop says they called him a priest, but they couldn't investigate. Thus, the bishop questions if the energy the king felt wasn't strange. The emperor asks if he believes it's the power of the 7th prince, and the bishop denies it, saying he's preventing the 7th prince from stealing credit. The emperor taps his finger on his throne, saying to Harmon Diaz that he doesn't believe whether his report is true or false but will commend him for protecting the citizens of Lonia, because he granted an honorary title to Gerald and will give territory in the northern region to the Holy Knight, saying he will also shorten the 7th prince's exile. Therefore, when the prince has fully recovered, he should be escorted to the palace. Harmon knocks on the door and says he has returned from His Majesty's mission. Thus, he enters the room under His Majesty's command, with only a single candle illuminating the space. He remarks that the prince looks healthy, but Juan replies with a sarcastic remark, saying that for someone who has faced death, this wasn't surprising, revealing himself as the first prince. Juan notes that his eye is worsening and that they don't have much time to talk, warning the knight not to get too close as he heard what happened on the battlefield. He moves his hand toward Harmon and grabs him by the collar, asking if he protected the 7th prince for His Majesty, accusing him of protecting the trash who sullied his mother's name, a woman who sacrificed everything for them, and questioning if Harmon was justified in his choices. And when he decided to help that bastard, Harmon only addresses him as, "Your Highness." Juan says he made the wrong choice and sided with a scoundrel, asking how such a scoundrel could ever become emperor. However, Harmon responds, saying that Juan has worked hard and must be hallucinating again. The prince starts breathing heavily and apologizes, admitting he knows he's not that kind of person. Harmon tells him there's no need for apologies, as neither he nor the 7th prince is at fault, explaining that he himself is responsible for Ulysses' death, and that, regardless of the orders given, he should have stood his ground. Juan says that everyone is dead and asks how he could stay alive thanks to the 8 troops, admitting that due to his curse, his skin is scarred, and he's only good as dead. Harmon addresses the first prince, asking if he truly hates the 7th, and Juan replies affirmatively, saying it's obvious, accusing him of blasphemy and carelessly squandering the life their mother gave him. Harmon then questions, wondering if the 7th prince pretended to be a fool, hiding his true intentions to seek revenge for Ulysses, and to build his strength, acted like a scoundrel and was exiled on purpose. Juan interrupts Harmon's musings, asking if he's ill. Harmon denies it. The prince orders him to rest if he feels tired, but Harmon says he has orders from the emperor, and will soon leave for Lonia. Juan agrees, saying that if it's an imperial order, perhaps it's time for that fool to return. 3 weeks after the death wave in the kingdom of Lonia, Grill wonders how long he'll have to keep doing this as he digs with his shovel, commenting that after working hard and cleaning for 3 weeks, this place might finally be called a village again. But he grumbles about not receiving any compensation, reflecting that while it wasn't a rule, people should help during hard times, and he couldn't leave Charlotte in such a place. Until he notices some objects in a box. He wonders if they are remnants of the dead. Seeing the box glowing faintly all day, Grill thinks that if they're relics from years ago, they're ownerless items, and if he polishes them until they shine, perhaps they'll find a new owner. So he picks up the items for cleaning, commenting that he's worked hard to help the people in this village and deserves a good reward. Spotting a piece of paper inside the box, he wonders how the paper survived intact, then picks it up to read, questioning if it might be valuable. Charlotte knocks on His Highness's door, asking if he'd like more food. However, Alan declines, lifting a meat bone with his fingers, and remarking that this is the first time he's eaten this much. Charlotte says it's because he's just woken up after 3 weeks, and the doctor ordered him to eat. Alan agrees, saying he needs to rebuild his stamina, noting that the fact he can even walk is a miracle, questioning how much divine energy he used, and reflecting that the power backlash he experienced was severe, but just being healed through divine power and medicine is already miraculous. After all, his body was too exhausted to endure such an ordeal for long. Bandaged, Alan jokes about whether he has turned into an undead. The doctor asks why he's making morbid comments, saying this is his specialized treatment, but Alan orders Charlotte to remove the bandages. The doctor then remarks that, honestly, Charlotte is far closer to death than she realizes. He explains that when the prince fainted, he treated Charlotte and discovered she possesses both divine power and mana, asking when she became exposed to both. Alan asks what the issue is and if that's really a problem. The doctor says that, generally, such exposure would make someone sick, disabled, or even dead, as it's rare for a body to evolve through it, noting that looking at her is like seeing His Majesty 50 years ago. After His Majesty fell into a coma from defeating Amon, his body underwent a duel between mana and divine power, requiring repeated reconstruction, ultimately leading to evolution, and he had heard from someone that the reason Celtic could defeat Amon was due to his superhuman body, questioning if this was the case for the girl. Charlotte attentively looks at Alan. Seeing Charlotte, 16 years old, with a superhuman body, Alan looks at her. She questions him, and the prince reflects that people with such physiques could become heroes. Alan says he's bored and wants to read books, asking if Charlotte can fetch them, and she agrees. The prince reflects that it was good to have obtained Amon's skull, but the backlash was significant, because his body couldn't handle it, and while divine power could be used efficiently, it was difficult because it differed from mana. So they should start with theory for now. With books on magical theory by the Sacred Emperor, Divine Power, and the Resurrection of Rafael Astoria, Alan reflects that it's good that every detail was written by this person, but his faith was extreme, dedicating the book to the great goddess Gaia. Alan reflects that he must learn to control his divine power and use zombies efficiently. The two hear a sudden knock at the door, but the prince simply allows entry. Harmon greets his majesty and says he's awake, and Alan says he was expecting him, saying it's been 5 days since he woke up and heard about Harmon going to the castle. Harmon says he returned with news. Alan reflects that Harmon had given a significant reward when they dealt with Morgana, wondering if he would offer money or a vacation, until the knight opened his mouth, saying that the orders came directly from his majesty, ordering the prince to return to the royal castle. Alan shuts his room door, leaving Harmon outside. Charlotte says His Highness should return because it feels like someone is calling for him, but Alan tells her to ignore it. The girl repeatedly calls him and asks if he doesn't want to return, until the prince asks why he would go back to such a dangerous place. Alan reflects that he still doesn't know who is behind Morgana's case. Charlotte repeats the word dangerous, with a sad expression. Alan tells Charlotte to ignore it because Harmon will handle it alone, and after that day, Harmon continued his requests without stopping, even sending letters for the prince to accept. Or when Alan was sleeping in his room, outside the room, Harmon notices someone, seeing Charlotte leaving, who says she has a message from the prince, telling Harmon to leave before he throws salt at the knight. Harmon asks if Charlotte is going home, and the girl says she's staying outside the castle. The knight offers to escort her since it's nighttime, but Charlotte says she's fine. Harmon says it's because he wants to know why the prince refuses to go to the castle, asking if he said anything to Charlotte, and the girl tells him Alan mentioned the place being dangerous. Harmon says it's true that his position in the palace isn't great, and Charlotte reflects that, as expected, his relationships with his siblings aren't good, and someone is after his life. The girl wonders if she could become stronger than she is now. Later, she meets Grill near her home. Grill says she's late, then notices the knight Harmon. Harmon asks if he's the one who fought Morgana, and Grill agrees, saying it's only natural to help people. Thus, Grill says he's heading inside, but Harmon asks if he's okay with explaining how the fight with Morgana went. Grill says he only dealt with a few zombies, and Harmon agrees as Charlotte enters the house. Hearing that Grill also managed to remove the claws of the vampire count, Charlotte asks what that is, and Grill is surprised. The girl says she's never seen that document on the dining table, and Grill says it's his talisman, which he hasn't used for a while. However, it seems old because he's had it for a long time, but Harmon notices it's a family document, even seeing the seal of the Jerez family. The Jerez family was the one that defended Northern Lonia 50 years ago, and it was a family annihilated during the battle with the Necromancer King Amon. Harmon reflects that they were more loyal to the Emperor than anyone else and questions why a document from this family is there. But the knight is quickly surprised, wondering if these two are survivors of the Jerez family. Harmon reflects that he now understands where their strength comes from, and since their lives were hidden after the family fell, they've been taking care of the prince without anyone knowing. Out of endless devotion to the sacred Emperor, Harmon begins to speak to the two of them, saying he respects their desire to keep their mission secret from everyone, but Grill asks what desire he's talking about. Harmon asks Grill to accept his letter of recommendation, saying he could refine his daughter's skills and noting that she seemed to want to stay by the seventh prince's side. Therefore, he would write a recommendation letter for the Holy Knights. Grill asks if Charlotte would be going to the palace, and Harmon confirms, adding that it wouldn't be difficult for her to obtain a noble title, and if she desired, she could even learn the swordsmanship of the Holy Empire. Thus, she could assist His Highness much more effectively. Charlotte places her hand on her chest and says she would like to try becoming a knight, but if she became one, she would have to stay away from His Highness, and she didn't want that. Harmon assures her that protecting the prince is her mission, saying he would work hard to guard the prince alongside her, and reflecting that he would do whatever it took to escort the Jerez family and the prince, even bringing all three of them to the imperial palace. When Harmon arrives at Alan's room, Alan says they can leave. The knight is surprised, and the prince declares they are going to the palace. During the journey, Harmon asks why the prince suddenly changed his mind. Alan questions what he means, and Harmon reminds him that just a day ago, he had shut the door in his face, refusing to go. Alan begins explaining what happened, reading a book and wondering how they came up with the idea of using divine power in such a way, saying he wanted to practice it, until he notices the book ends abruptly there. Alan remarks that it's because the book wasn't in the Imperial Library, and Harmon agrees, saying that's true. The knight observes that the prince is working hard to study his magic, but Alan says it seems interesting, adding that once he reaches the castle, he'll see the library for himself. Harmon agrees, but advises him to relax while they are in Laurensis, saying this city is far wealthier than any in the land of the dead. There are many things for the prince to enjoy in this city. Alan and Charlotte look excitedly at the view before them. Charlotte notes how many people there are, and Harmon explains it's because it's the capital, a prosperous land. Then asks if His Majesty likes this place, but Alan says it stinks, surprising Harmon. The prince says he has a question for Harmon, asking if he would ever admit that the capital of the Holy Kingdom harbors an undead resident. Alan slips away, walking through the city, until he bumps into a fresh fruit vendor. Alan apologizes, saying they have urgent matters to attend to. The prince reflects that the street seems lively, but he's certain there's a vampire's spark in the city, and if he follows it, he will surely find it. Harmon and Charlotte ask if His Majesty found something, but Alan notices a box containing a head, a crying head adorned with flowers. All three are stunned by the sight, as the vampire opens its eye, begins crying blood, and starts gasping for air, then screams, startling the trio. Alan readies his shovel in hand, and strikes the vampire's head with a diagonal slash, splitting it in half. As the head falls, Charlotte asks if that was the undead. Alan explains he's heard of similar situations but finds this strange. He lifts the head, and sees a body hanging on a clothesline, reflecting that the torso and head are there. A voice from the alley says the boy is being followed. Alan turns, and Harmon asks where His Highness is headed, mentioning a middle-aged red-haired man, surprising the two. Alan says that man has been following them for some time. Harmon remarks that it's likely him, and Alan explains it's difficult to track him as the spark vanishes there. The knight says they'll report this once they reach the palace, and the prince remarks that he came here only to learn magic, but he's now getting involved in something dangerous because of it. Laurentis is in chaos due to similar assassin cases recently. On the streets, it's because of the bizarre murder cases, and in the palace, it's because of the visit of the exiled prince. Thus, reactions were varied and chaotic, yet he, the subject of the rumors, enters safely. Meanwhile, Harmon implores the prince to stay quiet, saying he will report it, and urges him to remain silent since the banquet is tomorrow. Alan assures him he understands. Harmon comments that Alan is still a child, leaving the prince without a reply. He continues talking about Charlotte, but the girl interrupts, saying she'll take a look around the palace. Harmon says that if anyone asks who she is associated with, she only needs to mention his name. The girl agrees, while Alan says he will go to the library. The knight tells the prince to simply walk down the corridor since it's on the left side of the courtyard, and Charlotte says she will escort him after finishing her patrol. Alan walks off, reflecting that he may have made a mistake, but seeing it that way, it felt like he could sense the spark, and the vampire may already have entered the palace. However, since it seemed dangerous, he decided to stay quiet, as Harmon advised. He wonders if he should just leave after finding the magic book, reasoning that it's better to have a delayed book than to get involved in this case. Alan walks through the courtyard, reflecting that he should head to the library and focus on that first, noticing that he has already been down this path. He says he's been walking in circles in the same place, but then notices a statue and asks who it is of. Approaching the statue in the courtyard, and reading that the name Elisha is engraved on it, he reflects that, based on how it's written, she has been dead for a long time. But then hears a voice behind him, saying that leaving these brats was a mistake, as they ended up forcing the old man to do it himself. The old man asks if he should cut their necks to use as decoration. Alan wonders if he's an assassin. The gardener asks how lazy people could be to pay others fees, but then turns to Alan, saying he should have come to greet him. The gardener orders him to grab the shovel and dirt nearby, but Alan explains he's not a gardener. The old man says the tree lacks decoration and that Alan's head would be perfect, prompting the boy to retrieve it. Alan complains that he's getting the new clothes Harmon gave him dirty, but it seems there's been a misunderstanding, and the old man thinks he's a new gardener because of his appearance. Alan drops the shovel and dirt on the ground, asking if that's enough, and says it's all a misunderstanding and that he's leaving. Then, noticing the amount of dirt, he offers to lend the old man his handkerchief, taking it from beneath his cloak, and saying that, if possible, the old man shouldn't work alone and should ask others for help. The gardener remains silent, but grabs the prince's hand firmly. Alan asks what he's doing, but the old man says it's true that he lost his memory, and his personality has changed. Thus, the boy looks directly into the gardener's eyes. It was the Emperor, asking how Alan couldn't recognize his own grandfather. Alan walks through the corridors, cursing under his breath, until a door opens, and someone announces that the 7th prince is entering. Thus, he stands face to face with Celtic Alphals, who says his grandson is there. Alan could never have imagined this man was the sacred emperor. The emperor says he heard Alan played an active role during the subjugation in the state of Lonia, and the boy agrees. Celtic asks if he also killed the vampire count, as he was informed. Alan reflects that he needs to think first, since the citizens of Laurentia know about the incident, but there's no way the emperor doesn't know that a vampire was behind it all, so it's better to recall his contribution in Lonia. Thus, he stands before the emperor, and reflects that Celtic is likely planning to find someone to capture the vampire. so he's merely verifying the facts of this case. Alan finally decides after much deliberation, saying His Majesty is correct and that he indeed did it. But he wasn't ready to capture him alone when he died and returned to life. And that's why he could only do it with the help of Harmon, Charlotte, Jenid, and Grill, along with the citizens of Lonia. Thus, it wasn't solely his power. Meanwhile, Alan reflects that he should share credit to prevent problems. Celtic remains silent before his grandson, then takes a deep breath before speaking, saying that he heard well. Alan reflects that the Emperor seems confused, and so the Emperor says that, since Alan has come all this way, he should rest, and Alan agrees, saying he hopes the vampire hunt concludes safely. Celtic is surprised by Alan's words. After the boy leaves the room, the Emperor reflects on whether he heard this from Harmon. Because only half a year ago, Alan was a cruel scoundrel, but now he is proud to help others and even knows about the vampire news in the capital. Celtic wonders if Alan lost his memory, his personality changed, and what role Grill and Charlotte play in all this. Based on what Harmon said, they were descendants of the Herreys family. If that were true, they could assist in the hunt for the vampire since the Herreys family was not known for using divine power in their swordsmanship. According to the report from Lord Jenid, the 7th prince had saved the lives of soldiers who were on the brink of death by using divine power. The Emperor wonders if that was all, as there were also stories about the goddess's blessing descending when the prince prayed, and the shot he took at the vampire using his ornate weapon. All of it was done by someone wearing a mask, but Jenid claimed that person was Alan. The Emperor reflects that he initially thought it was nonsense, and asks for the noble's opinion. One noble insists it must be a lie, arguing that the prince had said he didn't spend much time on the battlefield, and that the masked figure being the prince made no sense. The nobles begin discussing how they might have made a mistake, saying it was improbable for the 7th prince. Celtic places his hand on his head, calling them short-sighted, reflecting that the time to step down from the throne was approaching, yet he lacked a successor to assist him at this moment. Then, the Emperor remembers Elisha in her final moments, thinking that if nothing had happened that day, he would have chosen Juan as his successor. But it was his fault for being cold-hearted and prioritizing the kingdom over his grandson. He then recalls Alan and wonders if there's any potential in that child. However, his thoughts are completely interrupted by the nobles arguing amongst themselves. Celtic shouts, threatening to silence them with his fists if they don't quiet down. But someone urges the king to calm down. It is a man who has just entered the throne room with the intent to participate in the meeting, saying they are wasting too much time. He suggests investigating the matter, revealing himself as Count Palmer, an acquaintance of Luan. The Emperor addresses the Count, who mentions that the anniversary of Elisha's death is in 2 months and suggests it would be good for the 7th prince to be at the castle, as he had contributed to the vampire hunt. He also recommends that, with the banquet approaching, the prince should be allowed to rest. Celtic agrees, stating that the Count is right, and with the banquet so near, there's no need to rush. They will follow that plan. Alan arrives at a door and remarks that he has finally found the library, wondering why the path was so convoluted as he opens the door. However, someone calls out to him, surprised to see him there. Alan reflects that he doesn't recognize anyone who would be there at this hour, and the girl tries to introduce herself, but she quickly apologizes, saying she will leave immediately, confusing Alan. Alan tells her she can stay seated and notes how uncomfortable she seems, which doesn't make sense to him since he hasn't done anything. Alan remains silent, observing the girl as she fidgets with books in her hands, and remembers she was the maid who stood by him when he was exiled. The memory has haunted him for a long time, and he realizes the girl before him and that maid are the same person. Both fall silent, creating an awkward atmosphere, but the system identifies her as Alice Astoria, granddaughter of the Archbishop, with high divine power and extensive knowledge of magic. Alan reflects that it's no surprise she feels uneasy in his presence, thinking she likely assumes he's a pervert pursuing her for amusement. Additionally, her surname matches that of the author of the book he's looking for. Alan wonders if the book's author is the same Archbishop, whom he once called a slave of Gaia before his exile. Thinking about his connection to the author, he doubts his questions would even be answered. Alan apologizes if he startled her, explaining that he lost his memories and forgot most of the people from the palace. He reflects that he wouldn't believe himself either if he were in her place, but he quickly says he'll just grab the book and leave. However, he notices the book isn't where it should be. He reflects that it's missing, and Alice asks if he's looking for her grandfather's book, the Archbishop's work. Alan nods, and Alice says she was reading it but offers to give it to him. However, Alan insists he doesn't want to interrupt her reading. Alice hands him the book, explaining she was just cleaning the books before leaving the library. Alan notices the book is titled Book of Resurrection and reflects that it's an incredibly grandiose title. Alice explains that she is a memory of her grandfather's research and not special, as it is impossible to resurrect people. Alan is surprised and asks what that means. He picks up the book while asking why resurrection is impossible. Alice explains that no matter how much life is given through divine power, it cannot capture a soul, something only necromancers can do. However, since necromancy comes with a dangerous price, there is no good to be done with it. Alice concludes by saying that resurrection is impossible without a miracle. Alan asks what would happen if someone had sacred and magical power in the same body. This surprises Alice, leaving her speechless. But she says such cases are extremely rare and that if both were used simultaneously, the body would explode. Alan says he doesn't think resurrection is impossible. Alice asks what he means, and Alan explains that the book says if one wants to use divine power better, they just need to pray more. Since sorcerers use mana, dark mages use life, and Alice adds that improving divine power without prayer requires a magical tool. But she also questions if resurrection is possible. However, Alan says they're wasting too much time talking. He tells Alice to hurry home because she seems uncomfortable around him, but the girl denies it while being ushered out of the library. Alan says he will turn off the library lights before leaving and wishes Alice a good night. Alice is surprised by Alan's gesture. She repeats the word, resurrection, reflecting that it could just be a bluff from the Seventh Prince. But something felt different this time, because she sensed something unique in the Seventh Prince's aura during this encounter. The Archbishop appears and calls Alice. She greets him as her grandfather, and the Archbishop asks what she was doing. Alice says she was studying in the library, and Raphael remarks that her curiosity is much like his but advises her to be careful since Alan has returned. The girl simply agrees with her grandfather. Raphael hands her a plague mask, telling her not to push herself too hard to stay standing. Since she is chosen by the goddess and has great talent, working too much would bring heavy responsibility. Alice tells her grandfather not to worry because she's as strong as he is, and Raphael says she truly is his granddaughter. Raphael then orders them to proceed, opening a door with several priests behind it. Luan, the first prince, is groaning on his bed. Raphael announces that today's treatment will begin. Thus, the priests, along with Alice, begin praying for Luan at his bedside, making the first prince moan in pain as the treatment is performed. Meanwhile, Alice reflects that her grandfather was right, because in the face of the curse afflicting the first prince's body, her divine power was useless, and at this point, he didn't have much time left. But she truly wanted to find a way, no matter what it took, thus recalling her conversation with Alan, when he said resurrection was possible. Even knowing it was impossible, Alice remembered Alan, thinking it would be extraordinary if it were true. Alan grabs some papers and asks if that's all, seeing some family trees without even the names of his mother and father. Harmon questions the necessity, thinking Alan remembers them, but Alan explains he still doubts his amnesia and must tell everything to his master. The knight lowers his head for a moment, and says that if both were still alive, Alan would have lived a completely normal life, making Alan question if that's all. Alan looks at Harmon with suspicion, but notices the knight truly cannot lie and reflects that he wants to know about his family relationships, but it seems suspicious. However, Harmon says that more importantly, the banquet is approaching, asking Alan if he plans to attend, to which Alan asks if he should. Harmon says mistakes would lead to ridicule, but Charlotte has learned etiquette to protect him, and Alan asks if he can't just enjoy his life. The knight continues, explaining that a party and a banquet are different, and at this point, his brother, the first prince, might also appear. Alan asks who that is, and Harmon says it's on the family tree, that he is Luan Alfals, his elder brother, and the one Alan should be cautious of. Luan, lying bloodied on the floor, asks about the banquet, questioning if they would really hold a banquet for someone like his brother. During the banquet, there were many musicians, also, many beautiful dishes, and nobles socializing with each other. One of the nobles says he's happy to see Alice after so long, and she says the same. But she reflects that her grandfather sent her, remembering how he instructed her to attend the banquet for the seventh prince, saying she should at least make an appearance, since he was busy caring for the first prince. However, Alice is called by someone, and she turns to see who it is, spotting Count Pomer, who remarks that she still looks beautiful and that everyone believes her to be the reincarnation of Gaia. Some nobles gossip about Count Pomer, saying he is focused on supporting the citizens. Alice overhears them saying the Count has no interest in power but is instead devoted to helping people, and she tries to leave. However, Pomer tells her she's already leaving, adding that what they said wasn't entirely untrue, as after his wife's death, his only purpose in life has been volunteering. Pomer admits that it isn't exactly noble. However, Alice says that's not the point, insisting that he deserves much respect while reflecting that it's strange, since the Count was undoubtedly a good man and had served Elisha in the past, but now he's solely dedicated to the first prince. Instead of seeking power, he is focused on the first prince's health, and he often advises others. Yet, for some reason, Alice feels uneasy in his presence, so she excuses herself, saying she needs to meet others, and the Count says he'll move along in search of another meeting. Alice reflects that she doesn't feel well, but her attention is drawn to two people, as Lord Genid remarks that he was invited to such a place, while Grill tells him to calm down since he's also a commoner. Genid asks where the 7th prince is and questions how he could leave them alone. Alice approaches, thinking it's been quite some time since she felt comfortable at a banquet, prompting Genid to ask if she's the Archbishop's granddaughter. The girl confirms, introducing herself as Alice, though Genid mentions he has only seen her from afar. Meanwhile, Palmer stands in the crowd watching the conversation, moving his finger in a strange manner, but he is interrupted by Alan's entrance, with the narrator stating that Alan is under the protection of the Holy Empire, and accompanied by Charlotte and Harmon. Alan looks straight ahead, showing no reaction, while Palmer observes the scene out of the corner of his eye, then looks directly at the 7th prince. Alan reflects that this is unexpected, since, as an exiled prince with no claim to the throne, no one ever paid attention to him. Yet everyone watches Charlotte walk through the ballroom. Alan wonders why she's attracting so much attention, remarking that she seems more like a noble than he does and that Charlotte's lessons have paid off. Harmon adds that innate posture cannot be taught. Alan asks what Harmon means by innate posture, but Harmon denies saying that and asks if Alan thought so. However, Palmer approaches, commenting that it's been a while since he's seen Harmon, prompting Alan to ask who he is. Harmon scolds Alan, saying he's not behaving like a prince and that the man is Count Palmer, but the Count says it's fine. Palmer mentions it's been a long time since they last met, and it's understandable if Alan doesn't remember, extending his hand toward the prince. The Count says the prince seems to be having a difficult time and apologizes, but Alan shakes his hand, saying there's no need for that. As their hands meet, Alan reflects that Palmer had served his mother and later assisted the first prince. The system activates, and Alan notes that he should remember the few people who supported him, but he is stunned when he sees the system's screen, which reveals that the Count is a vampire in his 3rd state. Alan is shocked and realizes the Count is a vampire, causing his hand to sweat unintentionally. However, an energy begins to surround them, and the Count asks if Alan enjoyed the banquet's food today. Alan says it was delicious and notices that he released divine power unconsciously, yet the Count doesn't react. The Count remarks that it's a relief since it's been a long time since the prince tasted royal cuisine. Alan wonders how long Palmer has been at the palace. Alan turns toward the crowd, prompting the Count to call his attention, as Alan looks at everyone standing behind the Count, noticing several vampires among them, leaving him utterly stunned. Palmer asks if Alan is looking for someone, but the prince replies that he was simply reminded of something disappointing. As a waiter passes with drinks, Alan asks for a glass, taking it in his hand, and commenting, of course, that it's alcohol. Purifying the water, Alan remarked how disappointing it was that alcohol had been allowed at the organized banquet. Palmer smiled while looking at the prince. Alan, finishing purifying the water, smiled as well. Letting the water reflect both of them, he asked if the Count would like a glass as well. Palmer said it would be his pleasure, taking the glass. Alan reflected that it was fine, encouraging the Count to drink, because he had infused the water with divine power, turning it into holy water. And if the Count drank it, his true identity would be revealed, as Alan was certain Palmer was the man from the silhouette. If the Count's identity came to light, the murderer behind the recent cases would naturally be exposed, Alan thought as he observed the Count drinking. However, the Count showed no reaction, laughing instead, claiming he drank it in one gulp but already felt a bit tipsy. He apologized to the prince, saying he was weak to alcohol. Alan responded that he didn't seem drunk. Palmer replied that it was because he wasn't drunk yet. However, Alan grabbed a bottle, startling all the guests at the party, and broke it, making the Count question what was happening. Alan then used the broken bottle to cut the Count's hand. Everyone asked what Alan was doing. Count Palmer urged him to calm down, and Alan noticed that the wound wasn't healing. He wondered if Palmer was truly a vampire, but Harmon appeared, saying the 7th prince was drunk. Harmon suggested the Count step away to treat his drink-induced ailment, and Palmer agreed, saying it was the best course of action. Palmer then moved away from the prince and his entourage. Harmon asked why His Highness had done such a thing, and Charlotte questioned if he had sensed something unusual. Alan said he thought the Count was a vampire, prompting skepticism among his companions. Harmon suggested capturing him, but Alan said they had no evidence and needed paper and a pen for now. The knight asked why Alan suddenly needed them, but the prince said it was obvious. They were going to hunt a vampire on their own. Palmer saw a door in the corridor. He quickly ran to it, approaching and finally opening it. The vampire began coughing, vomiting blood shortly after. The Count cursed the 7th prince with his words, as his mouth burned from the holy water. Palmer reflected that the prince knew who he was, as it was impossible for someone to offer holy water instead of alcohol. The vampire decided he would have to cut out all his burning organs, because new blood and fresh flesh were all the Count needed. A maid called out to the Count from outside the room, saying she was there to clean his quarters. The Count smiled and invited her in. The maid asked for permission, but the Count said it wasn't necessary and she should clean however she felt comfortable. Noticing a puddle of blood beneath the Count, he told her she had arrived just in time because he needed someone like her. Minutes later, other maids arrived, greeting the Count, who was now fully healed. Fama replied that it had been a delightful dinner, explaining that the people at the palace were likely busy with the banquet, and the maids responded that the Count was the only one who cared for them. The Count recalled the maid Milia. He praised her, saying he wanted to hire her, and told the maids to inform the chamberlain. They spoke well of Milia, but the room was filled with corpses and blood. The Count said it wasn't anything special and that he would leave first, but one maid corrected him, saying that wasn't the way to the banquet hall. Fama paused and said he wasn't going to the banquet hall. He was heading to visit the first prince to wish him good night. Alan finished writing on some papers, and Harmon asked why there were so many. The prince replied that they were only the names of those seen on the first floor, and Charlotte remarked that it was a long list, while Harmon added that there was no evidence. However, none of them were relatives, and the situation wasn't entirely bad, prompting Alan to ask what relatives were. Harmon explained that Alan knew about the evolution of the undead, because after their evolution, if someone was born as a vampire, they were called a relative, like the Count they defeated previously. After all these circumstances, relatives create their own kind, but their specialty was hiding among humans, prompting Alan to ask if they could even hide from the Sacred Emperor. Harmon admitted that the prince was entirely correct, as they could replace the bodies of the humans they killed, surprising Alan. Alan concluded that the severed heads they saw without bodies were creations of the relatives. Harmon confirms that the vampire might have left only the head since a human body holds more divine power than a vampire's. Alan clenches the sheet of paper tightly, and hands it to Harmon, asking if he holds a high enough position. The vice commander confirms, saying he can only mobilize a single troop. The prince orders them to capture everyone listed and evaluate the situation first, but to kill if necessary. This declaration and order surprise Harmon. Alan assures him he will take responsibility and instructs Charlotte to assist Harmon. Harmon comments that moving troops during a banquet might seem like rebellion, but Alan questions why that matters, saying that since they can't yet prove they're vampires, they should kill first and present their ashes. The Count must already know that the prince is aware of his identity, so if he doesn't act, his life will be in danger. Harmon agrees, and Charlotte tells His Highness to be careful. Alan reflects that now he just needs to hide, but someone approaches and calls him, remarking how long it's been since they last met, and greeting him as little brother. It is Raphael Alfals, 21 years old, the third prince. Alan notes his name as Raphael Alfals, and Raphael mentions he heard about the prince losing his memory, trying to provoke him, but Alan interrupts, stating that he is the third prince while reflecting that Harmon had spoken about him, calling him a mama's boy even the emperor was aware of, a prince with zero presence. Raphael coughs, saying Alan remembers him, but Alan denies it, saying Harmon told him, and Raphael brushes it off, adding that none of their other siblings attended the banquet that day. So Alan shouldn't feel disappointed, and they probably had more important matters than celebrating his victory. Alan reflects that Raphael just wanted to irritate him. Alan remarks that Raphael's presence is more than enough, and Raphael boasts, saying he had the time to attend, placing a hand on Alan's shoulder, and saying that if Alan came to the Imperial Palace to cause trouble, he was happy to see him remain useless at times. However, if Alan intends to claim the title of Crown Prince, they would become enemies. Alan looks indifferently at the hand on his shoulder, but Raphael tells him to continue living his life however he wants, and leaves, saying he's heading out. Alan reflects that, in any case, Raphael has no chance of becoming the Crown Prince, but he should forget that fool and focus on his task, as he doesn't know how strong Palmer is and needs to conserve his energy, and hide until Harmon and Charlotte finish their work. However, a voice suddenly shouts, calling Alan Alfals, ordering him to come over. Alan reflects on how incredible it is for someone to yell his name so loudly, and wonders how terrible he must have been for people to hate his name so much. But someone tells Luan to stop. The 8th prince turns to see who is behind him, and someone says that if Luan continues, something bad will happen. Alan notices it is the first prince, Luan Alfals. Luan exhibits several intense traits and, according to the system, harbors a desire to punish anyone who dishonored his mother. Alan reflects that Luan's rotten smell is as if he's living in a dead body. However, the boy is grabbed while thinking that Luan's willpower is exceptionally high. Luan questions how Alan dares to insult his subordinate. People murmur as Luan mentions that the Count served their mother, though he doesn't think Alan knew, and questions why Alan insults the gods and opposes them. Luan demands to know why Alan continues to tarnish their mother's honor. The Emperor arrives, demanding to know what's happening. A butler announces the divine protector of the Holy Empire, the ruler of the entire empire, His Majesty, has entered. Celtic asks why no one is answering. The Emperor begins to release energy, and says he asked what his grandsons are doing. Alan reflects on how Celtic's voice contains immense divine power, and tries to steady himself alongside Juan. But the first prince starts coughing blood, prompting Celtic to halt his aura. Celtic orders the archbishop to fetch the healers to treat the first prince, and Raphael agrees. The emperor then commands the seventh prince to explain himself. Celtic says he heard about Alan insulting Count Palmer, and the boy confirms it. The emperor asks why, while Alan reflects that he can't reveal he was planning to hunt the count, as that would insult him. And Alan wonders if he should try to say that the count is a vampire. But he looks at his grandfather, realizing he wouldn't believe him. Alan says he was drunk and made a mistake, and the emperor asks what mistake that was, as Juan is being healed. Celtic questions if that is the truth, and Alan reflects on what kind of reaction this is. The king seems to expect him to respond the same way next time, and the two stare at each other. Alan says there is no other specific reason, but Juan steadies himself against the table, ordering everyone to get out of his way. He grabs a goblet from the banquet table, and hurls it at his younger brother. Celtic calls out to Juan, but the prince asks forgiveness for his rudeness, explaining that his subordinate was humiliated by Alan, and that it's not something he can overlook, asking the emperor for permission to challenge his brother. Celtic questions how Juan can even suggest this in his current state, and says he will discipline him for his actions after understanding the situation, ordering Juan to leave, but the prince refuses, saying he has heard about the great credit Alan earned in Lonia, making his majesty turn. Juan questions if he could duel Alan so the king could see his true abilities, to determine whether Alan is truly skilled enough to capture vampires or merely taking credit from others. Juan asks if his majesty isn't curious, and Raphael pleads with the emperor to protect his grandson. However, Celtic looks down and merely sighs, stepping aside for the two, prompting Raphael to ask what his majesty is doing, saying he should stop them, while Juan declares that the sacred emperor has approved the duel, so he will resolve Alan's insolence himself, because his brother would be the best to prepare Alan for this. Alan reflects that no one even asked his opinion about any of this. The nobles gossip that the seventh prince is picking another fight and that it's best to leave. Grill, irritated by the nobles' actions, questions how arrogant they must be to think that their seventh prince is a scoundrel when he is a good person, but Janet stops him from continuing, and apologizes to Alice, saying Grill is weak to alcohol, but Alice is entirely entertained and engrossed by what is happening below. Alice says she thought the seventh prince gave a note to Harmon and asks if Janet knows what it contains, but he denies it, asking if it's important, and Alice says it just bothers her a little. Alice wonders why the seventh prince shared a drink with Farmer earlier, as if he was expecting something to happen, but she pushes these thoughts aside, saying now is not the time to dwell on them because she needs to focus on the first prince, and not let him strain his body. So Alice turns and says she will leave first, descending the stairs and wondering if something bad will happen to the first prince because the fight should end safely. Alan grabs a piece of wood while wondering why this body has such a bad relationship with its family, because they are allowing someone nearly dead to duel, and Juan looks like a walking corpse. But Alan quickly turns his head, reflecting that no one expected the sacred emperor not to stop the duel, and only the archbishop seemed concerned for the first prince but wasn't taking his side. Raphael says that, for safety reasons, divine power cannot be used during the fight, not only because the first prince's body cannot handle divine power, but also because if the seventh prince hunted a vampire, he shouldn't need it now. This is an opportunity to test his body and martial arts, making Alan reflect that this is ridiculous since he only used divine power, because he doesn't even know how to use a sword, and the two people responsible for protecting him aren't there either. So this is his only possible path. Juan looks at Alan and asks what that is, seeing the boy in a battle stance and asking if he's serious about this. Juan says it's fine and asks his majesty to start the duel impartially. Thus, both face each other, holding their wooden swords. Celtic tells them not to forget to respect one another, raising his hand high, lowering it to signal the start of the duel. Alan advances with his sword toward Juan, aiming to strike his abdomen as his brother raises his sword. Alan prepares his sword for the attack, almost striking his brother, who is ready to retaliate. But Alan halts his own sword, and kneels to the ground, surrendering. Juan is extremely surprised by this. Alongside the emperor, Raphael and Alice are also astonished. The seventh prince declares that he, Alan Alfals, surrenders because he fears for his brother's death. Hearing this shocks all the nobles present in the hall at that moment, causing the emperor to cover his face with his hand, asking if Alan is trying to avoid conflict, or if he's concerned about Juan's condition. Juan calls him pathetic, and says the emperor has commanded respect among brothers. Juan slams the floor beside Alan. Alan calls out to his brother, but Juan says he's not just looking down at his subordinate but also at Alan, who appears undead, and that all these insults are directed at him as his brother. Then Juan starts beating him while insulting him, and Alan tries to remind him of their dignity. But Juan charges a blow with divine energy, telling him to forget dignity because he couldn't forget what his brother had done. His body begins to take damage, and Alan realizes Luan is using divine power, and his body will explode if he doesn't block it. Alan wonders why his grandfather doesn't intervene. He summons a divine energy shovel and declares this is the end. The priests notice the summoned shovel, and Alan blocks the blow, with people wondering where that shovel came from. The mages say they don't know how the prince could use subspace magic, but another mentions there's no mana flow, so it must be divine aura. Meanwhile, the two princes exchange blows. Alan asks how Luan can push himself so far with that body since he'll be in danger if he continues. But Alan notices something in the crowd. He sees Farmer behind Luan, watching him. Alan pauses for a second to process this, then readies the shovel and realizes this is all part of Farmer's plan, saying he can't leave, and everything will be resolved if Farmer is killed. Alan finally attacks Luan and apologizes to him. Luan is momentarily shocked by this, but Alan tells him to accept the blow, then attempts to strike him. Alan hits his brother's abdomen, sending him flying, and declares he will ensure vengeance against his brother's enemies. The people notice Luan falling and bleeding, calling out to His Highness, who prepares another strike with his hand. Alan remarks there seem to be many of them in the palace, and the nobles comment that another item has appeared in the seventh prince's hand, a weapon infused with divine aura. Raphael shouts that Celtic must stop Alan because, even though a weapon might not be capable of killing an opponent, it could be dangerous from this range. He declares he will act in Gaia's name, assuring the bishop not to worry, firing and stating that his target is someone else, aiming at Farmer, who is among the crowd. Alan easily hits Farmer's head, causing him to fall backward. Alan says if he could just pray for a little longer, the power would be much lower, and that he must do it again. People shout that the seventh prince has gone mad, and the emperor orders the holy knights to stop him. One of the holy knights responds that he will do as his majesty commands, placing himself in front of Alan. Alan yells that he is in the middle of a dispute, while reflecting that he needs just one more shot to definitely kill Count Farmer. Alan recalls the fight, remembering how he blocked the attack when he summoned the shovel, and even the moment he summoned the weapon and fired at Count Farmer. Celtic approaches and says something is happening, noting that the first prince is also aware of it. Luan agrees and says he remembers what Harmon had said, commenting that Alan pretended to be a scoundrel to be exiled and seek revenge for their mother. Now, seeing his abilities, Luan considers it might be true. That was why Luan wanted to ensure his worthiness as the Holy Emperor. Luan squeezes blood from his wound before his grandfather, stating that, as Celtic can see, he is already dead, because he wanted to do whatever it took to rid himself of the curse and become the Holy Emperor, but he has reached his limit. Therefore, if he seeks vengeance against those who called his mother a commoner, he should make Alan the next Holy Emperor. Luan says Alan truly intended to kill Count Farmer, because if Alan wanted to humiliate him, he could have just shot him, but instead, Alan was obsessed with Farmer. However, Luan says he cannot understand the reason. Alice approaches Luan to help him, and Raphael says he needs treatment, prompting the Emperor to allow it. Asking if Alice knew where Harmon was, the girl replied that he had left the banquet hall during the fight and hadn't returned since. His Majesty stroked his beard for a moment while thinking. He asked about Count Farmer, and Raphael mentioned that the Count had gone to a room for treatment. Celtic ordered Raphael to summon him. Raphael questioned why he was bothering a patient, but Celtic asked if he hadn't been injured by his grandson and needed treatment himself, raising his hand high, and asking if placing a bit of divine power on his head would be considered treatment, because it would be very appropriate to crack his skull open. Raphael said he wasn't sure what the consequences would be. Alan cursed everyone while imprisoned, yelling that he had been jailed again. He reflected that he had only injured someone and ended up in this situation, wondering what would happen if he killed the servants again. Alan banged his head against the bars, and wondered if Harmon and Charlotte had failed, as the palace was eerily quiet. He had noticed how confident the Count appeared in the banquet hall, and knew Farmer had tricks up his sleeve, but staying in the palace now was like being in the enemy's stronghold. The vampires disguised among the nobles could exploit their noble status and have human knights capture the culprit. Using this opportunity, the vampires could switch into their human hosts and escape. This situation had worsened due to his attempted assassination of the Count. While complaining, someone arrived and asked if he had caused a commotion there too. Alan tried to respond to the person, but he noticed it was the third prince, who told Alan to address him as elder brother, and said he had seen Alan's fight, so as close brothers, they shouldn't be quarreling like that. Alan noted that Raphael seemed pleased. Raphael explained that it was just his mood, and Alan thought Raphael was happy because losing a competitor for the throne would benefit him. But Alan quickly realized Raphael, being a prince, had the authority to release him, so he asked his elder brother to let him out, but Raphael asked what Alan would do if he faced reprimand from the Emperor. Alan questioned whether the first prince wasn't in a critical condition already, and said if he had any virtue, he should act quickly, which was why he would visit his brother, asking if Raphael knew his personality. surprising his brother. Alan said if the third prince released him, he would see something very interesting later. Outside, Alan wondered if Raphael hated the first prince that much. After all, not only had he helped Alan escape, but also led him to the armory. Alan felt relieved to be out of the prison but didn't know what to do since no one could help him, and the vampires shared information amongst themselves. He then wondered if it was time to use some power, because he had someone with more authority with him who could act freely, and he would have to ask for such help. Activating his ability, he said he needed something to clear the way, summoning his army of soldiers and instructing them to clear the path. But first, they were to cover their faces with some armor. Alan dressed them in holy knight armor and said he initially wanted to handle this quietly, but the vampires kept toying with him, and the first prince didn't understand for him to explain. Alan opened the door and said that for now, they should head to the first prince. The maids begged him to stop, asking what he was doing with those soldiers. Alan told them to act as if there was some drama, while other soldiers shouted about rebellion, claiming that the seventh prince was starting a rebellion. Alan ordered his knights not to kill anyone and to just clear the way. A soldier called for reinforcements, saying the seventh prince was heading to the first prince's chambers. The battle between the soldiers was intense. Alan used the opportunity to slip away. One of the soldiers shouted that the seventh was heading to the first prince's room and must be stopped. Thus, Alan opened the chamber door and faced several priests, who questioned why he was there. The zombie soldiers restrained the priests, who pleaded with the prince to stop as they were in the middle of treatment. However, Alan ordered them to barricade the door and let no one in. The restrained priests begged His Highness not to do anything, but Alan shut the door on them. Outside, everyone called for His Highness. One asks what his brother is doing. Alan responds that he didn't want this either, but he had been left alone earlier. Therefore, due to his brother, the vampire hunt was ruined, and Juan asks if he's talking about Fama. Alan asks if he knew, but Juan denies it, saying that by looking at him, he could tell what Alan was up to. But Alan is wrong, and the priests have already confirmed it. However, the seventh prince questions if they are certain of their verification, as these vampires have human-like skin, making it difficult to distinguish divine power from their skeleton. Therefore, it would be challenging for ordinary priests to recognize them. Alan remarks that while everyone seems comfortable, the palace is filled with vampires. Juan asks why Alan claims Fama is a vampire, and Alan retorts by asking if Juan believed him. His brother says that if what Alan shows is true, everyone will believe him just by hearing the truth. Alan repeats that point, saying that if Juan wants the truth, he himself no longer wishes to involve himself in this confusing family and the vampires, and summons Amon's skull, saying he can no longer escape this mess. He puts on his mask and declares this is the reason. But first, his brother must pay for his deeds. Alan readies a strike with his weapon, hitting Juan and demanding he pay with his life. Raphael arrives with a soldier, who reports that the seventh prince entered the first prince's quarters, prompting the priest to ask why they didn't stop him, calling them pathetic fools, as he readies a divine power strike, and knocks down one of the prince's soldiers, questioning how they could be worse than an old man. The soldier falls to the ground without armor, and Raphael notices it's a corpse, asking if the seventh prince's troops are undead, and whether he's had a necromancer all along. However, this is not normal, as the zombies exhibit the same pure divine power as other knights. Creatures in this world exist under the laws of the world, making this impossible even with magic. Raphael wonders what in the world the seventh prince has done, and orders everyone to secure the corridor, and ensure no knights can enter. He reflects that he must save the first prince before revealing their identities, fighting through several soldiers with divine energy. Raphael faces the door and says he must find whoever summoned them earlier, throwing back several divine knights, and questioning what is happening. As the undead soldiers fall, the divine knights question what it all means. But Raphael reaches the prince's room, witnessing a terrifying scene. The eighth prince stands atop the bed, a shovel piercing his brother's body, declaring that they should consider his brother has already paid, and now he should be resurrected. Juan reflects that many strange things surrounded Fama, as he only reported Alan's bad behavior, saying Alan continued to claim they were brothers of the same low status as their mother, and insulted her. Juan realizes he should have known that when Fama immediately reported the incident, he was inciting him. But the reason Juan hadn't suspected Fama was that, since childhood, he was the only one who stayed after their mother's death. Never realizing he was a vampire, Juan calls himself foolish. Seeing Alan emanating energy, Juan reflects that it makes sense why his brother chose to kill him. Allowing himself to be pierced by him, his soul begins leaving his body, moving toward and embracing Alan. But Alan begs him, saying he is the Legion and Gaia's successor. Juan's soul is pulled back into his body, even surprising the spirit, which returns, causing the body to groan in pain, then rise while coughing blood. Raphael, standing at the door, observes the two, breathless. Juan realizes his body no longer hurts, and breathing is easy. While Alan watches his brother, asking how he feels in his new life, Juan notices his restored skin, remarking that his muscles and bones feel intact and that the curse tormenting him has vanished. He concludes this must be a miracle. Alan is surprised by the sight of his brother. After some time, Alan explains that he used a great deal of power to revive him, and promises to give a more detailed explanation later. But first, he must find Harmon as the prince gets dressed. Alan says he will finish what they started and that it will be an easy task for the prince. Juan walks through the castle, reflecting that he should take charge of what his brother is doing, as, without errors, it is entirely flawless. He notices Harmon and Charlotte speaking to a guard who isn't letting them in. A hand rested on Harmon's shoulder, who commented that the guard had already said the same thing. But Juan said his companion only followed his commands, making the knight turn and ask who he was, seeing him and immediately being surprised, asking if this was the first prince. Harmon inquired if the curse had been cured, and Juan replied he would give details later, requesting the list. The knight clarified if he meant the list, and Juan confirmed, explaining that Alan personally asked for his help, adding that the miracle that occurred in his body was pure evidence of everything. Harmon handed it over, stating it was the list of vampires, and Juan asked if that was all of them. The knight confirmed and said many were nobles from other countries. Juan remarked that his authority was significant, so he could restrict them as well. Harmon asked for his highness's forgiveness, and the first prince said he had done well. He thanked him, saying the great hunt would be easier, with chains dragging on the ground, because ever since he used his power, several individuals carrying scythes appeared. These hooded figures declared that they followed the commands of the first prince, Juan Alfals, as the Inquisitors of Heresy and the Order of the Red Crusade had been summoned. The Inquisitors of Heresy and the Order of the Red Crusade were soldiers trained to detect heresies. Only the first prince could summon them, so they obeyed solely his commands, being one of the 5 strongest groups in the Sacred Kingdom. Juan thanked them for gathering so quickly and mentioned it had been a long time since the last hunt. He handed them the list of names, stating they were the bastards who invaded his kingdom and assassinated his mother. Thus, they should open their chests and pull out their hearts to test, then crush their skulls if they found any magical power flowing within their brains, killing them with endless pain and giving meaning to the futile lives of vampires, because this was a hunt against them. A soldier was thrown across the room. A noble asked who dared to attack a family of knights, questioning if they thought he would forget about this, only for his head to be severed. The leader of the Inquisition held his head, saying there were traces of magical power beneath his skin. It was confirmed that the people on the list were vampires, and the soldiers were ordered to kill them all. The Inquisition soldiers massacred the banquet hall, as they heard the screams of the vampires. The vampire nobles lied, claiming they were real humans and asking who had betrayed them. Outside, the leader ordered the capture of vampires who managed to escape the palace. Harmon reflected that they cared about nothing but hunting the people on the list, and were literally on a hunt. He noted that Count Fama wasn't found there, so they should locate and capture him for now, but Juan told him not to worry, saying Fama had gone to a far more dangerous place, because he was certain they had discovered something suspicious about the Count by now. Celtic questioned why Fama wasn't responding to him, demanding an answer, standing as he asked. If Count Fama was a vampire, Fama wondered what was happening. He had heard the Emperor intended to treat him for the disrespect caused by his grandson, and he was merely planning to refuse. But this wasn't part of his plans, seeing Celtic ask if he was too direct in his questioning, apologizing for being disrespectful and stating that if Fama was a real human, he would apologize later. However, if he was a vampire, Celtic would not let him leave. Fama asked if the Emperor was doubting God since priests had already confirmed him as human, but Celtic said he didn't trust the priests, and expected the Count to speak only the truth. Fama reflected that he could hear the sounds of vampires throughout the castle, as they were being pursued and hunted, even those who had fled the palace. Wondering why now, when everything was fine until Alan was sent to prison, unaware of how the vampires ended up being hunted like this. He thought he should escape as quickly as possible. However, being pursued by the Sacred Emperor in this way, Celtic interrupted his thoughts, commanding him to look at him, asking how someone so young could have worse hearing, while Fama noted there were no soldiers or knights around, saying he knew Celtic as the hero who defeated the Necromancer King Amon, but now saw him as a man on the brink of death, because he was unlike them, who had eternal life, and was merely a living creature with limited time, especially since he had become a relative, causing the Count to laugh. Celtic questions what was so funny, and Fama continues laughing, saying the Emperor is just an old man while Celtic reflects on his disrespectful tone. Fama then declares that he truly is a vampire, and bites his own hand, tearing off his arm in front of the Emperor, saying he wouldn't speak politely to an old bastard like the Emperor, because he is a predator who feeds on men like him. He then reveals his true form, and prepares his hand, declaring that he will consume the Emperor's body, a relic of the past. attempting to strike him and claiming that doing so will earn him recognition among other vampire kin. Fama's hand moves toward the Emperor, but Celtic merely looks to the side indifferently, until Fama's hand strikes him. Fama raises his hand, claiming the Emperor has no power at the moment, and now is merely at his mercy. However, he hears a cracking sound in his palm, realizing his vampiric hand is being pried open by the Emperor with his bare hands. Celtic then swings his hand, shattering Fama's arm, advancing toward the vampire with his fists ready to strike, delivering a blow while declaring that Fama isn't even a true vampire kin yet, and has no reason to believe he could defeat the Emperor. As Celtic had slain Aman, the Necromancer king, and impaled his skeleton, a mere mosquito couldn't challenge him. He then addresses Count Fama, declaring himself the great holy Emperor, Celtic Alphals, and places his hand against the Count's head as Fama pleads for mercy. Without hesitation, Celtic separates Fama's head from his body. Fama groans in pain while in the hall, his head in the Emperor's hand. Celtic acknowledges Fama's greater power compared to others, but orders him not to escape as he wants to learn what happened behind Ulysses' case. Celtic says Fama should look forward to it, as it will be worse than death. Meanwhile, a woman remarks that the palace has been noisy, noting the 7th prince escaped prison and now there's a vampire hunt, as she plucks petals from a rose in front of Raphael. The woman asks if Raphael helped him escape, but he denies it. However, she throws a vase at his head, causing him to groan in pain while the woman scolds him, saying he should have just stayed put. This is Rose Darina, the crown princess. Rose grabs her son, lamenting that he's ruined everything, but has a moment of clarity, and embraces him, apologizing and asking if he's hurt, saying she loves him. She declares that, no matter what, she will ensure Raphael becomes the next emperor, and that she remains the crown princess, not a commoner like Elisha. She asks if her son understands her. Raphael simply agrees, saying yes, and confidently states he will definitely become the next holy emperor. 3 weeks later, the Holy Empire's legal office resolved everything smoothly, as half the individuals on the list were dealt with during the hunt, and the rest were executed publicly. This brought relief to anxious citizens and served as a warning to hidden vampires. Meanwhile, the Inquisition army remarked that they never expected such a large number of vampires for their research, as many of them became the subject of endless experiments. This incident in the capital reverberated across the continent, especially the emergence of someone capable of identifying vampires, which moved the entire continent. Attention turned to Alan Alphals. Meanwhile, in the throne room, Raphael commands silence, stating they will begin the interrogation of the 7th prince. Alan is taken aback and apologizes, asking the reason for the interrogation. Raphael accuses the 7th prince of mobilizing troops and disrupting the imperial palace, claiming he violated imperial laws. Alan reflects that he might be imprisoned and left to live among vampires. Celtic interrupts, saying this isn't funny, drawing the room's attention to him, and states that he doesn't understand a word of what Raphael is saying. The Emperor asks what kind of violation the prince committed under the laws of the Holy Empire. Raphael claims that Alan led troops without permission, thus committing rebellion. But Celtic counters, stating that in emergencies, anyone connected to the Crown Prince has the right to command military forces. Juan interjects, saying there's nothing wrong with what his brother Alan did, adding that even he, the one behind this case, and the Emperor are fine with it. There is no issue. Alan reflects on how his family is protecting each other, and remarks that he feels quite relieved. Juan adds that if there's a problem, they should simply call the Heresy Inquisitors again, and have them uncover any malicious intent. Celtic agrees, saying it is enough to check whether Fama will start a rebellion, or simply resolve the issue with Alan. He asks the Archbishop if that is correct. Raphael asks him to stop with that attitude, saying he knows it's just a formality. He adds that after the interrogation, Celtic could take credit for handling the vampires and treating the first prince. Raphael then asks if it's entertaining to make fun of an archbishop, while Alan reflects that there might be a reward ceremony after all of this. Alan wonders how the bishop deals with the imperial family, as he seemed impressive earlier in the morning. Raphael says they will skip to the next item on the agenda. He announces that the interrogation will conclude. However, he pauses for a moment, and a priest asks if something is wrong. Raphael states that before finishing the interrogation, he would like to ask the 7th prince something. Alan asks what it is. Raphael proceeds with his question, wanting to know if Alan is involved with necromancy. Alan freezes for a moment at the question, reflecting that this question has finally come. Because, of all people, the Archbishop had discovered his holy undead soldiers. And with the Archbishop's knowledge of magic, it's clear why he would be curious about these creatures. Since both the Emperor and the 7th Prince had also received this report, this time, they would likely remain silent. Alan coughs into his hand, preparing himself, saying no, it's impossible. But Raphael counters, saying there were witnesses. Alan asks who saw them and if it was the priests present, but Raphael tells him to stop evading the question, saying knights and healers in the hallway had tied up the holy undead, yet they vanished later, because those same undead were seen following the 7th Prince Alan. Raphael asks if Alan will continue lying in the face of this evidence. Alan says there were many vampires in the Imperial Palace that day, and they might have used tricks to confuse the holy knights and healers. Raphael replies that such tricks might fool some knights, but not an archbishop like him, and Alan reflects that he's right. Because speaking about holy undead here, with priests who've never encountered such things and wouldn't believe in them, this is why he can still deny it, but he might be able to persuade the archbishop, asking Raphael if he is genuinely curious about this, because he could tell the truth. Raphael is taken aback by this, and asks if Alan is admitting to it, but Alan shakes his head, completely denying that he is admitting anything. Raphael grows frustrated at this. After the meeting outside, Alan meets Charlotte and says it's cold, as his maid greets him, saying he has worked hard. She places a coat on him, asking how his body is holding up, since he has been bedridden for the past 3 weeks and must be exhausted with an unplanned schedule. But Alan says he's fine, just drowsy, reflecting that after using Amon's skull, he had to rest for 3 full weeks in bed. He hadn't realized the penalty for resurrection was so severe but knew it wasn't easy. Harmon approaches, greeting His Highness, and Alan says it's good timing, because he has a favor to ask his knight, and Harmon asks what it is. Getting closer, Alan explains that his shovel has broken into pieces, and since nightfall is approaching, he will need a new one. Harmon asks if Alan plans to continue using shovels even in the future, questioning why his master doesn't learn swordsmanship, but Alan asks why he would use a sword as a priest, adding that his hand has grown accustomed to the shovel, and he can't manage without it. Harmon says if that's the case, he could just make a new one, and Alan inquires about that. Harmon mentions a mine that produces iron and magical stones in the northeastern region, the territory of Hilda, governed by the First Empress, known as the Empire's Greatest Forge, where contracts with dwarves are made to create all kinds of items. If Alan doesn't want ordinary tools, he could even have magical weapons or a rifle. Alan says that sounds good and asks why they don't go during their vacation, but Harmon says he came to speak with Charlotte. Charlotte questions why him, and not the prince. Harmon says it's true and sudden, but the Sacred Emperor is looking for her, making Charlotte question why. Celtic asks Juan if he believes Raphael spoke the truth about the holy undead, and Juan confirms, saying Alan has already performed miracles by resurrecting him. And other priests doubted Raphael, but his reaction was enough to remove people from the scene for a while. Thus, Juan says he would trust Raphael's words. Celtic says he doesn't know anything for now, whether it's a violation of the law or if Alan is hiding something. Juan asks why Alan didn't tell the truth, but Celtic says Alan didn't fully trust his brother, as he had been neglected and isolated by him, and also intended to distance himself after the accusation of murder. Therefore, it was natural for him not to believe Juan. A servant enters, saying they have a letter concerning the First Imperial Empress, and Celtic orders them to bring it in. Celtic picks up the letter from his desk, and remarks that now that they've dealt with the flies, only the beasts remain. Juan asks about the beasts, wondering if Celtic will send the Holy Knights, but the Emperor says he will deploy the Green Crusade, noting that the opponent seems cunning, and their territory is a forest, neutralizing the effectiveness of the Green Crusade. The vampire hunts across the country have stirred the beasts. Celtic asks if there are any other messages, and the servant replies that Grill, Charlotte, and Harmon are waiting. The Emperor states that he summoned them himself, and orders them to be brought in. Harmon and Charlotte bow before His Majesty, while Grill appears nervous. Celtic says it is good to see everyone and that he called them to reward them for protecting the North, surprising Grill when he hears the word reward. The Emperor introduces himself to Grill and mentions that he heard about his efforts in helping Alan and standing by his side, stating this is why Grill deserves an appropriate reward. For now, Celtic says he will grant Grill a title, proclaiming him the current head of the Herays family. Grill hurrays. This shocks Grill, as Celtic explains that not only did Grill help defend the Northern Territory, but he was also the only noble to support his grandson Alan. Thus, he will grant him the title of Marquis, leaving Grill speechless. For his daughter, Charlotte Herays, Celtic grants the title of Holy Knight and assigns her to serve under his command in the Golden Crusade. Celtic tells Charlotte that if she wishes to live a peaceful life, he won't force her, but it seems she has already made up her mind. The Emperor says he will offer her all the support in his name and appoint the best fencing instructor for her. Charlotte expresses her desire to follow the 7th Prince and remain by his side. Celtic says he is honored by her loyalty and declares Harmon a remarkable individual, granting him a territory free for his use. He hands a document to Charlotte, stating that she may be blessed by Gaia and the Empire, leaving the throne room. Harmon expresses happiness at Grill's loyalty throughout this time, but Grill asks what just happened in there, questioning what Harmon meant by Marquis and Herays. Harmon explains that Herase is Grill's family name, and that he saw it in the document. Grill mentions that he found that document on the ground. Harmon asks about this, and Grill explains that he found it in a body storage facility in Lonia, thinking it looked valuable. The knight asks about the monsters Grill supposedly hunted, but Grill admits it was all a lie, saying he couldn't believe the things he drunkenly mumbled became reality. Charlotte clarifies that the hunts were all done by the 7th prince, while Grill insists he's just a commoner and can't be a noble, so it's all a mistake. Celtic remarks that Harmon was too slow, turning a commoner into a noble without investigation, and says he cannot be promoted, with Luan agreeing, calling Harmon too naive. Celtic adds that having someone so slow makes it seem plausible that Alan went into exile on purpose. Luan questions whether Alan truly lost his memory, and Celtic replies that Alan didn't even remember him in the garden. However, the first prince disagrees, pointing out that not only in the palace but also in the land of the dead, Alan hunted vampires. He argues it cannot be mere coincidence. There must be a reason Alan brought them. This, Luan says, is why the Herase family is needed. Celtic counters that there were no survivors in the Herase family, as he knows from fighting alongside them, but questions if Luan finds Charlotte unworthy. Luan asks if Celtic means the girl from earlier. Celtic acknowledges Charlotte's talent, as recognized by Harmon, and says he doesn't trust Grill, but Charlotte will grow greatly. If she grows under the Herase name alongside Luan and Alan, Celtic is confident she will contribute to the strength of the Holy Empire. Celtic reflects that the power of his sacred kingdom continues to grow stronger. Luan remarks that he believes His Majesty dislikes nobles, and Celtic agrees, adding that he's certain the other nobles wouldn't hear this, but Charlotte might carry the lineage of a count. Speaking of the past, Celtic admits he could never fully understand the true value of Elisha. However, Elisha had been the first to mourn the disappearance of the crown prince. Luan agrees with the emperor. Celtic says it pains him to speak of the family this way and that it would have been better if he had taken care of his daughter-in-law. He mentions that Aslan's movements in the south have been strange lately, with signs of war, and Luan responds that perhaps Hilda's territory lacks weapons. Celtic says they need someone who can fight with powers and has strong divine energy, to which Luan agrees, saying they need the person who sees through. Both then look out the window. Luan remarks that thanks to the sacred emperor, this village is vibrant with life. The commoners are speaking well of the 7th prince. They say he saved Lonia's territory and is truly a priest. They toast in his honor while the two watch from the window. Luan and Celtic exchange a smile. A letter is delivered to Alan. It instructs him to send the letter to Hilda. It has been some time since his dear sister left home. Alan reflects that it has been 3 weeks since the hunt and that he was unconscious. Now he prefers spending time in the library over his bed, and the reason is clear. Many people are still searching for the 7th prince. It seems the sacred emperor has ordered everyone to stay silent, but rumors still spread. In the village, they call him a priest. Alan mutters that he would prefer to return to the monastery, just as Harmon arrives, greeting Alan, who startles and says he won't answer any questions. Harmon identifies himself, saying he's there to escort the first prince, and Luan explains that he requested to see his brother. Alan apologizes, but Luan says he's tired of so many people looking for him. Alan teases, saying his brother must have good days surrounded by young ladies, to which Luan thanks him, claiming it's all thanks to him. However, Luan explains that while he knows his brother is tired, he's here to inform him of an event he must attend, and Alan asks if he can decline. Luan says he's unsure if Alan is joking or genuinely unaware. He explains that the anniversary of their mother's death is approaching. Alan must attend the memorial service this year. Luan advises Alan to take some time off because palace life is challenging. He hands Alan a letter, directing him to Hilda's territory, where their sister resides. Alan reflects that he's intrigued by the place. He questions if he truly needs to go, and Luan says he can decline, explaining he concocted this excuse to get him out of the imperial palace. Because Hilda's territory is preparing for a hunt, he doesn't need to maintain his princely image and can even craft a weapon while enjoying his vacation. Luan teases that his brother might find some beautiful girls, and Alan asks him to stop. The first prince says, regardless, he should convey his regards to Hilda. Alan agrees, saying he'll consider it and take a break. Outside the castle, at Elisha's statue, Luan and Celtic stand with their eyes closed. Harmon stands nearby as well, while Alan holds some flowers. He says this was the crown princess who protected her children during a vampire attack. Placing the flowers before Elisha's statue, he declares that now they can leave. For Hilda's territory, Alan sits in the carriage and says it feels wonderful. Because Charlotte and Harmon couldn't join him, he reflects on how long it has been since he traveled without them and feels free. The weather is pleasant for traveling, but he notices the Crimson Inquisitors. He recalls Luan assigning knights to accompany him, and Alan reflects that it's comforting yet grim. The carriage suddenly stops, and Alan nearly injures himself. He peers out the window and asks the Inquisitor what's wrong, who points ahead of the carriage. hearing bandits ordering them to stop, claiming they don't know where the troops are from. The bandits demand everything they have, and the Inquisitor remarks that they seem to be bandits. Alan asks if it doesn't look like a group of lunatics and questions if they seriously want to attack them, as the bandit repeats his demand. The prince says he's heard about Hilda's festival and suggests the bandits might have mistaken them for circus troops, so there's no need to hurt them too much. Alan reflects that while they shouldn't harm the bandits too much, the Inquisitors are terrifying. He feels relieved this scenario has turned into a cliché, where, during an adventure, the protagonist is attacked by bandits, and ends up killing them without a shred of pity. Anyway, he was just ordering people to do it. However, eyes were watching from the bushes, and from there, a creature emerged, targeting one of the bandits, attempting to bite him, and tearing off the bandit's head. The people screamed about a monster, saying it was a monster boss, as Alan opened the door and asked what was happening. Alan reflected that he could smell the stench from that place, and those sharp teeth paired with red eyes. It was undoubtedly a werewolf. The people remarked that it looked like a wolf, and perhaps because it was artificially created, it had weak power, but it was highly infectious. Thus, they needed to take down the monster leader first. Alan summoned his shovel and declared that the fight should begin, reflecting on the strength of the Legion, noting he shouldn't overdo it despite his recovery. He remembered Luan telling him to take the command of the Red Crusade, which Alan refused, saying it was too much. But Luan insisted they wouldn't just act as escorts. He mentioned something about Hilda's state, and promised a different carriage in case Alan felt uncomfortable. However, he warned Alan not to fight with Raphael. Alan had an idea and yelled for the Archbishop, saying it was a Legion, and that, even though the Archbishop disliked him, he should set aside personal feelings for the task. Raphael threw the door of his carriage directly at the Legion's head, striking it squarely on the forehead, and sending it flying several meters. Raphael remarked that they were beasts, half human and dead. He then struck his staff against the ground, and declared they should be put to eternal rest. As Alice stepped out of the carriage, Alan reflected that he was worried about other Lycans, and as if on cue, more of them charged toward the group, only to be punched effortlessly by Raphael, and hurled away with that strike. Alan realized he didn't need to worry about the fight as long as the Archbishop was there. The seventh prince wondered if there was something he could do, such as handling the Lycans, while Alice attended to the patients. Then he questioned if he should be doing some work there, but decided against it, thinking there was nothing dangerous during his vacation. However, a Lycan tried to attack Alan from the left. Alan drew his weapon and called the Lycan a bastard, but before he could fire, an arrow shot out, piercing the Lycan's head. Alan wondered where the arrow had come from, and then people on horseback arrived, shouting about Lycans ahead. It was the Green Crusade, ordering all Lycans to be hunted down. The Lycans growled, then fled as the Crusaders yelled that they were retreating into the forest. However, one of the soldiers warned against following them, stating the forest was their territory, and it would be an unfavorable fight. It was a young woman atop a white horse. She dismounted and mentioned it had been some time since she last saw the Archbishop, and also Alan, commenting that he seemed like a different person. She said she had heard the news but didn't expect him to change so much in 6 months. The woman asked if he had lost his memories, and Alan agreed. She said she should introduce herself, and Alan activated the system. The woman introduced herself as Hilda Alfals, the ruler of Hilda's territory, and welcomed him to her land. Hilda suggested they take a rest in the castle, addressing Alan as her younger brother. On the way to Hilda's castle, Alan noticed there were no signs of life on the streets, and all the doors were shut, as if her brother was right about the women. But the residents were hiding and didn't want to show their faces. There were many sights along the way, but one of them was the bodies of Lycans used as decorations. Alan wondered if this was the Lycan hunting season, and questioned what kind of territory this was. Frustrated, Alan slammed a cup down, cursing the first prince, asking what kind of festival this was, a blood festival, and muttering about how he saved Luan's life only to be sold out. Thus, Alan thought he should return to the palace as soon as possible. But Hilda explained that Lycans were different from vampires, stating they were the final form of dead beasts that had absorbed mana for a long time and evolved. Therefore, they possessed great intelligence and physical strength. She mentioned there were times when vampires controlled them with magic and made them pets. However, the Lycans formed their own groups. If magic was used against them, they would counter with sheer physical strength. Alan asked if they couldn't understand human language. Hilda clarified that these were created Lycans, but she was referring to the progenitor Lycan. Alan asks why she is talking about this, and Hilda asks if he wasn't there to help. She notes that, based on the expressions of their grandfather, the Emperor, and Luan, it was clear that was the expectation. Hilda says it's a matter without mutual agreement, while Alan clarifies that he came to enjoy the festival, not the hunt. However, he offers to let Hilda have the Crimson Crusade Order assist her. Hilda explains that the festival was scheduled to start next week, but due to the Lycans, it was cancelled, and Alan remarks that his brother didn't lie. But the princess says he did it knowing her talent, making the festival impossible at the moment, so she would assist him in other matters. Alan asks what these other matters are. Hilda calls for someone named Blorg to enter. Blorg steps into the room, introducing himself as the blacksmith contracted by the imperial family, and Hilda mentions she heard he wanted to work on some equipment. Since Alan is her half-brother, she doesn't plan to involve him in dangerous activities. She advises him to wait for the equipment to be completed and stay in the city, while Alan reflects on the rarity of finding someone in the imperial family who seems to understand him. The dwarf approaches and asks if Alan already has a primary weapon. Alan says he uses a shovel, leaving Blorg puzzled. The prince explains that he doesn't know what other equipment to use because he's always used a shovel, and the dwarf asks to see his hands. Blorg observes that Alan's hands aren't trained for any specific equipment. The dwarf says he can't just make a shovel and suggests it would be more effective if Alan stopped relying on them. He then promises to find a weapon that matches Alan's personality better. Hilda stands and asks Blorg to summon a servant, and the dwarf asks if she needs anything. The princess replies she wants to check on the training field's condition. Hilda clicks her fingers, saying it's been a long time since she dueled with her younger brother, and now she wants to. Alan gives a faint smile, but he says he will decline, and Hilda tells him not to worry, it won't be brutal. She adds that if he truly doesn't want to fight, he can simply defend, and she won't attack him. Alan agrees, admitting it's more comfortable as he tries to find the right equipment for himself. He tells his sister to go easy on him. Hilda asks if they can finally head to the training area. In the training field, Hilda and Alan spar with various weapons, first with a spear, then with a mace, and finally with a sword. Hilda instructs her brother to put in more effort, as they still need to test many weapons. They try out numerous tools, from gauntlets to even a pot. In every trial, Alan finds himself defeated. Hilda remarks that he is her half-brother and apologizes for not being able to care for him earlier, asking if this is the first time they've seen each other since Miss Ulysses' funeral. She notes that back then, she was very young and became occupied with managing her territory, and when she heard the rumors of Alan being a scoundrel, she hoped he would change. But now she realizes that didn't happen because she doesn't know what transpired during his exile. However, she thanks him for coming to see her. She promises to look after him while he's there, leaving Alan somewhat amazed. Yet Hilda remarks that Alan's current scores are 0. Blorg comments that Alan has the same level of skill with any weapon, while the other dwarves discuss his lack of a combat-ready weapon and his poor physical abilities. Hilda says she agrees with the dwarves' opinion, and Alan asks if this is what she means by taking care of him. The princess explains that it's important for Alan to understand his current level. She believes he should focus on improving his physical abilities for now, but Alan declines if it means more training. He wants to rest. He grabs Hilda's hand as he stands up. Hilda asks if Alan can truly use divine energy, and whether it works with any equipment. Alan confirms, saying he can enhance the essence of the equipment he uses, and Hilda remarks that this ability is his talent, enhancing the essence of weapons. Alan asks how she can be sure without even seeing it, but Hilda points out they just had a duel. She comments that while Alan's physical skills are terrible, he understands the essence of using equipment, and Alan questions why everyone keeps criticizing his body. Hilda explains it will be difficult to find suitable equipment in just a day or two, so he should rest for today, as he would fight again tomorrow and test his skills using random equipment. The battles continued for an entire week. In the end, Alan returned to Hilda's library exhausted. He remembered Hilda telling him to use divine power and reflected that, from the way she spoke, the fights wouldn't end today. Alan thought about being someone who used his brain more than his body and asked if he could use weapons, just as Alice arrived behind him. She greeted His Highness good evening. Alan recalled that she had been accompanying the Archbishop, and mentioned he also remembered her liking libraries, asking if the Archbishop was doing well. Alice confirmed he was. Both fell silent after that. Alan noticed that he didn't have much to discuss with her, and told Alice not to worry about him. Alice asked if he was researching magical enhancement, and Alan confirmed it. Then Alice said that, thanks to their last conversation about resurrection, she thought she could help him a bit, and sat by his side. Alan continued reading the books, while Alice observed him study, a smile forming on her face. The next day, Alice woke up covered in the library, hearing someone calling her. It was Raphael, who commented on her love for studying, though he was worried to find her sleeping in the library. Alice apologized to her grandfather. Raphael asked how she ended up sleeping there, and Alice explained she had been engrossed in studying and lost track of time, recalling her and Alan's study session. The Archbishop said she was just like him, and Alice wondered if he would get upset if she mentioned being with the 7th prince. But Raphael asked what Alan was doing, mentioning that he had resurrected someone, created holy undead, and managed all this despite being such a scoundrel. He then asked how Alan accomplished it, and Alice realized her grandfather had many doubts about Alan, but also noticed he was holding back from asking the questions he truly wanted to. They both had things they wanted to know about him. She asked her grandfather why he didn't just ask Alan directly, but before he could reply, they heard a sound, and Alice asked where it came from. Raphael said it was from the training field. Surprised, Raphael ran toward the sound, muttering that he was certain the seventh prince had caused another accident. Alice called after her grandfather, telling him to wait and insisting it wasn't the seventh prince, reflecting that Alan had also studied late into the night, so it couldn't have been him. But when Alice arrived at the training field, she noticed something, and Raphael asked what was going on, seeing a broken shaft. Alan had materialized a spear and broken Hilda's, prompting the archbishop to demand an explanation. Alice asked how the seventh prince managed to break the princess's spear, while Raphael questioned how a scoundrel had become so strong, noting that Hilda's spear was renowned as the best on the continent. Hilda, however, told Alan to try again, as Blorg handed her a new spear. Alan asked if his power was inadequate, but Hilda explained that he had strengthened the equipment with divine power, which was impressive. But a dwarf added that he had only increased the equipment's durability, with another dwarf commenting that Alan could strike randomly, and the result would be the same. Hilda said he was doing well and suggested trying another piece of equipment, but Alan retorted that it was easy for her to say and hard for him to achieve. He admitted he was expecting this scenario, but noticed Alice's radiant expression as she watched him. So, he decided to proceed, and Hilda encouraged him, saying that was the spirit, which annoyed Raphael. Hilda declared she would also fight with everything she had, preparing her stance. Alan moved toward her, pondering over what Alice had said the previous night, about how divine power responds to life energy. It could enhance his weapon, but it would react even more strongly within his body than with equipment. With that realization, Alan dropped his spear. Hilda was surprised by his action, and asked why he was placing his spear on the ground. But Alan prepared an attack with his hand, thinking he didn't know how to improve this, yet deciding to attempt infusing it the way he did with the rifle, astonishing Raphael and Alice. Alan clenched his fist with that ability, readying to deliver a punch, aimed directly at Hilda, striking the girl's shoulder, and shattering everything behind her. Alan and Hilda exchanged glances after the strike. Alan celebrated, saying it was incredible, and wondering how many points he earned for it. The dwarves shouted that a massive crater had formed from the shockwave and remarked on the frightening power, but they noted his posture was terrible and that he had only improved his body, awarding him 0 points. However, Hilda praised her brother, saying he was amazing. She added that he had learned to enhance his divine power in just one night, to which Alan explained he simply applied the same technique to his body as he did with weapons. When he was about to admit he didn't figure it out alone, Alice signaled for him to stay quiet. So, he thanked his sister, saying he wouldn't have improved without her help, and Hilda remarked that if she had blocked the attack, every window in the castle would have shattered. She pointed out that while his posture was slow, the strike was lethal, and Alan retorted that they kept calling him slow, asking if he lacked skills for hand-to-hand combat or weapon use. Alan thought about seeing it from another angle, realizing that having no particular talent for a single weapon meant he could use all of them. Hilda said he had done well and could rest so they could train more tomorrow, and Alan replied that he would look for more equipment later. Hilda teased that he seemed quite passionate about it, as Raphael and Alice watched. Raphael commented that he was sure Alan was still the same useless person as before, saving no one, and Alice insisted they leave. She mentioned returning the coat he gave her, but Raphael denied giving her one, asking if she wasn't wearing it from the beginning. Alice then noticed something, wondering if it was the prince who had covered her with this coat. She realized she was right and had forgotten she wore it on the last cold day, calling her grandfather to head back. A loud bell echoed throughout the area. Alan opened a door, asking what was happening so early in the morning. Seeing Hilda and Raphael, he asked if they were heading into battle. Someone shouted that there was an attack, as a group of lichens had invaded the mine. Alan reflected that this explained why the archbishop and Hilda were heading out together. He then spotted Alice and asked if she was assisting with the evacuation, telling people to leave because the lichens might infiltrate the area. Alan said he should just stay comfortably in the castle, but Knights of the Green Crusade saluted him. A dwarf approached, shouting it was an emergency, and Alan told him to stop coming so close. The dwarf noticed something strange. He asked the prince what had happened to the training field, which was completely destroyed, and Alan explained he was training, and that was the result. The dwarf asked exactly what he had been doing and noticed something else, asking where all the equipment had gone, as it had vanished, and Alan admitted they found his stash, reflecting that now he knew how to strengthen the essence of any equipment and wouldn't let the opportunity pass, storing everything in his inventory. He then asked if that dwarf also made rifles, because he wanted one, and the dwarf confirmed they had some. Alan questioned if the dwarf was refusing him because he thought him a scoundrel. The dwarf then said he would provide one to the prince, Alan remarked that a rifle's level was akin to decoration, but it would be different if it were for His Highness since he had shot a vampire through walls, and Alan asked if he had heard about that too. The dwarf agreed but asked if he could add a condition, and Alan reflected on this development. However, the dwarf offered to give Alan as many rifles as he wanted, but Alan would have to go test them right away. Alan asked if the dwarf was asking him to go into battle. He mentioned his sister and the archbishop were already heading out, but the dwarf explained that the Lycans' movements were unusual. Their numbers had increased, and it was the first time they seemed to be moving under orders. This suggested they had a powerful leader, and that was why everyone, even a mere prince, was needed, offending Alan. Alan remarked that the Red Crusade would be a great help but wouldn't move without his direct order, because they stated protecting the prince was their #1 priority, and Alan agreed, noting they had come there solely to protect him. The dwarf said the citizens were in danger, the princess, and he feared losing the place along with everyone in the mines, worried they might also be in peril. He then asked if the prince could deploy the Red Crusade to assist. When the dwarf was about to explain what to do in case of kindness, the bell rang. The soldiers shouted that it was an attack and the Lycans had invaded their fortress. Alan asked if they had ignored the soldiers and directly targeted the village, and the dwarf mentioned that their leader probably knew how to strategize. He then requested the royalty to help protect the village, and Alan asked if he could just hide instead. The dwarf called out to His Highness, but Alan complained a bit before finally accepting the offer. Several Lycans were attacking outside, and people were running while Alice evacuated them, with the soldiers protecting them. A woman with a child screamed that a boy was injured and called out to Alice. The mother explained that he had been taken by others, and Alice knelt to heal him, saying he was a good boy and that she would do it without causing him any pain. But the boy noticed something and panicked, shouting at Alice, telling her to run as the Lycans invaded the palace. The child called out to Alice as a Lycan leaped at her, startling her, but she grabbed the Lycan by the head and slammed it into the ground, shattering everything around it. The boy and his mother were astonished. Alice questioned how daring the Lycans were to attack a peaceful village, stating that, as the granddaughter of the archbishop, she wouldn't let them leave unscathed. The system appeared again, showing Alice had combat abilities. The soldiers informed Alice that the Lycans were surrounding her, but she instructed everyone to stay behind her. Alice reflected that she had learned to fight from her grandfather but had never faced so many monsters before, wondering if she could protect everyone. The Lycans charged, and Alice declared it was no time to feel weak, preparing an energy strike in her hand and stating she needed to protect them. From the city's highest tower, a glow appeared, followed by a shot that struck the Lycan Alice was about to attack. Subsequently, several consecutive shots rang out, leaving everyone questioning who was responsible. Alice looked up, thinking the only person who could shoot from such a distance with that much power was the 7th prince, who commented that it was expected from a rifle crafted by the dwarves, aiming and praising the extreme quality of the product. He then prepared another volley while the system showed he was using divine energy to amplify the weapon and activate the penetration ability. The shot diverged in the air, hitting the Lycans' heads, and destroying them with just one volley from his weapon. The Lycans tried to dodge the shots but were all caught by Alan's musket volley. Alan remarked that his brother was right, hitting the monsters with his shots, and saying he would definitely enjoy this trip while shooting. The members of the Red Crusade finished off the remaining Lycans with their scythes. Alan declared that this year was the Lycan hunting season, drenching the city in blood. The dwarf said it was impossible for him to have accomplished this in such a short time, and Alan asked if he hadn't expected this when making the deal. However, Alan admitted he really liked the weapon, noting its better divine energy consumption and additional abilities, relieving the dwarf. One of the Red Crusade soldiers reported that more Lycans were approaching, and Alan stated it was because they felt threatened by the bullets. Alan said he would evacuate the village first and instructed the soldiers to stop the approaching Lycans, to which the Crusade leader agreed. The 7th prince remarked he was becoming more popular among monsters, and the Crusade leader said the Reaper would pray for Alan. The dwarf muttered that they were only spouting nonsense, and hoped his deal with the prince was the best decision he'd ever made, wondering if Princess Hilda and her friends were safe. The dwarves had been tied up with ropes, and Hilda observed them telling her to forget about them. As they ended up holding back the princess, Hilda gripped her spear tightly, asking if the werewolf was taking hostages, and the wolf replied no, stating he only wanted to negotiate. Calling for Princess Hilda, this beast was the Lycan leader in Hilda's territory, Red Moon, and asked why he wouldn't explain the details to her. Hilda questioned if he meant negotiation, especially after capturing her citizens like this, and Red Moon asked the princess to remain calm, promising to release the people if she heard his conditions. He then said he wanted Hilda, leaving the princess puzzled. Raphael shouted, demanding to know what nonsense the Lycan was speaking and what he was thinking, but the Lycan replied that the decision was the princess's. Thus, the werewolf grabbed the head of the bound dwarf. The people screamed, calling out for Blorg, but the wolf warned them to mind their words, for, unlike vampires, they were beasts with honor. Then, the wolf threw Blorg toward the crowd, and the princess ran to help him. Red Moon told the princess to make a choice, claiming he had returned the hostage unharmed, while a soldier insisted they couldn't let the wolf go. Raphael stated that if she left, her territory would remain without leadership, but Hilda replied that she would leave it in his hands, and in those of her brother, the seventh prince, Alan Alfals. With that, she called out to Red Moon. She said she was curious why they wanted her, and asked if it was because she was a valuable hostage. The wolf responded that it might be so. However, their true reasons were peace and freedom, leaving Hilda questioning this. The werewolf explained that vampires were their enemies, and they sought liberation from the chains of servitude to the cursed vampires. Since the Holy Empire wished to eradicate all living vampires, they could form an alliance. Red Moon stepped closer to Hilda, saying that was their reasoning, asking if it wasn't a tempting offer. In the village, blood sprayed into the air. Alan remarked there was gunpowder everywhere, as he rested his weapon beside him. The crusade leader reported that all the monsters around the village had been defeated, and Alan praised them, asking the dwarf if the weapon was his. The dwarf was impressed and confirmed it was, but promised an even better weapon if Alan went to the mines. Alan cut him off, saying not to manipulate him. He noted the sound of horses approaching, saying everyone must have returned safely, as the dwarf expressed amazement, claiming the princess had succeeded. However, a crusade member mentioned something was wrong, as he didn't see the princess among the group. This made Alan question the situation. At the gate, soldiers instructed others to tend to the wounded first. The people rushed into the kingdom, welcomed by others who asked about Princess Hilda, but the soldiers apologized, saying they had been hostages and that Princess Hilda had been taken prisoner by the werewolves. The dwarf grabbed Blorg, cursing him, asking how he could call himself a dwarf, but the people intervened to stop the fight. The dwarf questioned how they could have left the princess behind, while Alan observed that they suffered only minor injuries and it didn't seem like a significant battle had occurred. A member of the Green Crusade saluted His Highness, and Alan asked if the Archbishop had stayed with his sister. The soldier confirmed this, stating Raphael didn't want to leave her behind, and Alan asked how he intended to do that, and who would lead the village now. The soldier mentioned that they didn't think they'd be away for long, leaving Alan pondering the meaning of this, because the soldiers seemed calm despite their leader being missing. Then he stated that he knew where the princess was, and that they would wait there, so the prince should join them, but Alan questioned if they meant him, asking what would happen if he refused to go. A quarrel between the dwarves continued as the soldier remained silent, saying he would beg Alan to join them. On horseback, Alan asked if they could go slower. In the end, he followed, noticing scared dwarves while the soldiers remained calm. A soldier explained the bond between the dwarves and Hilda, but they trusted Hilda's abilities, and since she was with the Archbishop, they believed there would be no problems. Alan agreed, saying Raphael seemed very strong. The crusade leader questioned the word seemed, and a soldier commented that Alan had lost his memory. The dwarves didn't care about the outside world and didn't know, prompting Alan to mutter why they spoke so vaguely. Raphael Astoria had authored many books, but most history books bore his name, because he was the great hero who fought alongside the sacred emperor against the demon king. Alan knew the old man was strong but doubted he was as formidable as they claimed, while the Red Crusade leader said his presence made the Lycans seem like newborn puppies. The werewolf praised Hilda, speaking of things like peace and freedom, questioning if that was all while she sat chained to a chair. The werewolf told her not to be mean, claiming he had watched her for a long time. He had seen her slay his creations, and that side of her was truly beautiful. At first, the werewolf had wanted to bite her and make her one of his creations, but for the sake of peace and freedom, he held back to negotiate with the Holy Kingdom. The werewolf then turned his head, saying she would no longer meet the frail old man and that, if she agreed to the alliance, he would grant her a Lycan army to command. As a memento of the alliance, he proposed making Hilda his wife, and if she desired, they could stay together until the end of her life. After ending the princess's life, he claimed he would give her a second chance as a Lycan, but Raphael began to act, freeing himself from the chains using his muscles and laughing. He remarked that he could no longer listen to so many people spewing nonsense, readying himself for combat. The werewolf was shocked by this. He questioned how a human could break the chains. Hilda commented that the werewolf did not know Raphael, while the Archbishop mentioned his years in the palace. Raphael said he felt refreshed after stretching his body for the first time in ages, though he was still unsure why the sacred emperor had left him at the palace, as he constantly worried the emperor. Hilda assured him that the emperor trusted him, while the werewolf attempted to make his voice heard. Raphael said Hilda sounded just like the sacred emperor, but the werewolf shouted for them to stop, demanding to know how Raphael could look down on him while speaking and asking if he wished for death so easily. However, he was interrupted by a massive blue light. Hilda questioned if he had claimed he could harm a woman and an old man anytime, but noted that neither of them had suffered any injuries yet. Hilda broke free and declared she had saved everyone, even giving the werewolf a chance to explain why he had threatened her territory. She remarked that it had been her idea, conceived personally. Meanwhile, the wolf reflected on the dire situation, as his body was filled with divine power to the point of near destruction. Raphael asked what Hilda planned to do, and she replied she would use her fists, while the werewolf wondered how they could be so calm, knowing their opponent was from the imperial family. Still, they were just an old man and a woman. How had things turned against him so drastically? The werewolf attempted to flee. Hilda told the archbishop they should act quickly. Raphael ready to strike, commenting it was expected of a beast to sense danger and attempt to escape. He launched his strike, throwing it toward the fleeing werewolf and the lichens, piercing them all with a single blow. Red Moon said he had been wounded by divine power and could no longer move his arms. Raphael approached, noting that, as expected, the werewolf had not been strong enough since he had not even cast a spell. He said he would now begin offering his prayers to Gaia, while Hilda reminded him not to forget to thank her. Raphael began his prayer to Gaia, and Hilda remarked it was a pity because she had liked them too. Red Moon questioned her, asking if she had liked his earlier proposal, but Hilda denied it, saying she only needed some animal fur to decorate her castle. The werewolf saw a monster in her eyes. Hilda stated that the dwarf they had released was a great blacksmith, and warned that if they had captured and harmed him, the emperor would have killed them. Red Moon scratched the ground in fear, then roared. Hilda told him not to move like that, as it was causing further damage to his arm due to the divine power, ultimately tearing it off completely as he fled the scene. Hilda noted that he had left his arm behind, and that they should quickly clean up the area. As a Lycan attempted to attack her from behind, she merely struck it with her fist, decapitating it. Hilda remarked that she would clean up a few things for His Majesty, the Sacred Emperor. Alan asked why they had brought him there, stating that, in this case, only his sister and the Archbishop were sufficient to deal with the wolves. A soldier explained it was to ensure perfect success and his experience, arguing that Her Highness Hilda would regret it otherwise. Alan reflected that she had not shown him such hospitality. Alan grumbled, saying he had followed them in vain, but the soldier insisted he not think like that, as it was for his own good, explaining it was the princess's wish, and they would do anything to fulfill it. When Hilda first arrived in that territory at the age of 12, she saved the dwarves from their lives of slavery, working tirelessly to build a territory out of the wasteland it had been. The Green Crusade joined Princess Hilda when she came of age. At the same time, she became an unquestionably special figure. Alan reflected that the soldier spoke of Hilda as if she were family, and with her ability to eliminate enemies without leaving a single trace, the unit had become renowned for exploration and tracking, spending their time with the princess there. The Red Crusade leader caught Alan's attention, telling him there was something ahead. A panting sound echoed. As footsteps approached the Crusade's army, it was Red Moon thinking the imperial family was insane. He needed to run since this place was his territory, and he should stay a while to recover and attack again. He heard someone commanding preparations for an attack and wondered if it was another unit. Seeing the prince and his army, Red Moon grew excited, saying it was an opportunity for human flesh. But he reminded himself not to underestimate anyone from the imperial family. First, he thought he should escape, eyeing Alan. Alan simply pulled out his weapon and asked if this was the one who had escaped his sister, shooting at the running Red Moon. The shot fired rapidly as Red Moon sighed, then headed toward him. Black Moon noticed many similarities between Alan and Hilda, and thought it was a mess. The shot finally hit Red Moon, who cursed the imperial family in his final moments. When the shot struck Red Moon, he realized it had hit his eye as he screamed, and his head was pierced, prompting Alan to ask if he was fine being on the front lines, wondering if he was a kin, or if his bullet was weak as he aimed again. Alan reflected that, first and foremost, his weapon dissolved and disappeared easily, so he could shoot long-distance targets thanks to the divine aura. Then questioned what would happen if he fired again. But several lichens charged toward the prince as Black Moon rose. The soldiers shouted that the kin was running. It seemed like he created those beings to distract them while fleeing into the forest, and Alan reflected it would be difficult to capture him there. But he said he had an idea, surprising the Red Crusade leader. Alan ordered them to split up, saying he would chase the kin himself, shocking everyone on the battlefield. The Crusade leader ordered half to remain and fight, and the other half to accompany and escort the prince. Then they raced after Alan. Alan noticed they were following him, but the fewer eyes, the better, especially for a weak kin. A perfect target for his new skill, thus activating Death Swamp. The water began circling Red Moon, and Alan commanded him to stop there, saying he'd heard rumors of lichens boasting of being honorable warriors, and questioned why he was running if he was scared. He remarked that seeing him flee suggested he had no honor to protect, and the Lycan cursed at him, saying he wouldn't run but would stand until the end if Alan would use that staff, then told him to take him to hell, To which Alan replied that's exactly what he was talking about, commanding all Red Crusade soldiers to cover their eyes and ears, asking if the words of the Imperial family weren't divine orders to them, saying he had an idea, so they should follow his command, asking if they didn't believe him, but the Crusade leader said he did, saying all the power Alan had shown, and his immense will to save others. He believed everything His Highness said, and would obey his commands, leading Alan to reflect that he didn't have much will, but loyalty to the Imperial family was enough. He then pulled out Amon's mask, saying it was time to begin, mentioning there were many things to test from the start. The Leakin questioned if Alan wanted to use his body for testing, calling him an imprudent bastard and commanding his creations to attack. But Alan dodged, keeping calm, because there was no reason to fail if he remained composed and held the equipment firmly, thus creating a skeleton from within the water. Skeletons began emerging from his swamp, clad in armor and wielding weapons. Alan reflected that, while he lacked talent for equipment, the dead who could wield it would now be under his command, using the skull and declaring himself a Necromancer, a master of the dead, activating the Death Soldier skill. The skill was activated. Alan fired a shot that triggered the divine aura and penetration effect, hitting all the Lycans with multiple volleys. Crimson Moon heard his creation's screams and said it was unbelievable that divine water appeared out of nowhere, and now even skeletons rose from the ground, wielding divine power. The werewolf thought Alan was bluffing when he said he wanted to test something on him, but this was nothing short of a massacre. Red Moon asked if Alan was done, and Alan replied that he'd used a lot of divine power, but it was enough, then said the beast's role was over, preparing a shot with his weapon and stating this would be the final test. The werewolf starts laughing, removing his hand from his face, asking if Alan really thought he could kill him so easily, charging toward the boy and declaring that if he went to the afterlife, Alan would go with him. But he is swiftly pierced by the skeletons. Alan begins to pray to the incredible Gaia, pointing at the beast and declaring that, with her blessing, he would ensure the equipment could kill the beast and cut it into pieces, bidding farewell to the werewolf with his weapon aimed at its mouth, and firing immediately after. The wolf is startled by the blue blast, staring at death in disbelief. The glow of the shot illuminates the entire forest, and afterward creates a clear path ahead for Alan. He removes his mask, and looks toward the Red Crusade army. Alan reflects that they had blocked their ears and closed their eyes, yet felt the immense holy power, and could no longer ignore it. He had tried to pray a little but had turned it into a mess, wondering why exactly he had come there. Alan tells the others to open their eyes and not be surprised, saying he had only made a small mess. A Crusader member retorts that it wasn't small, he had burned part of the forest. The leader of the crusade asks if it was the Leakin and about the holy power they had felt earlier, but Alan denies it, saying it was for capturing the beast. He then declares he is heading back home, telling the crusade to lead the way and return before nightfall. However, someone had been watching from behind a tree. It was Raphael, who had once again witnessed the holy undead. He reflects that they were nothing compared to what he had seen in the Imperial Palace last time. These undead were an army capable of wielding equipment, and he wonders how Alan could combine two opposing powers. But he reasons there was no other way, questioning if it was thanks to the blood of Aslan. The Southern Empire, Aslan, was a kingdom that revered the Reaper, and this was the reason they had abandoned Elisha, mother of Alan and Juan, as she was not only a commoner but also originally from Aslan. Raphael wonders if the 7th prince had inherited the lineage as well, but no one in Aslan's history had such power. He wagers that, even if he searched the entire empire, he would not find anyone like Alan. Raphael grows excited, unable to believe he finally encountered something he didn't understand, making his heart race. But he remembers his granddaughter and hesitates for a moment, though he cannot help but be impressed by the person who had once disrespected her, thinking that he wanted to help Alan grow and that, if he taught him more about magical power, he could become the strongest in the future. Thus, his mind is torn between the two thoughts, and he clenches his fist, striking a tree and causing a massive explosion, declaring he must report this to the Sacred Emperor, for if it were His Majesty's orders to help Alan grow, he feared he would have no choice but to obey. Frustrated, he admits that this was not his will and asks Alan Alfals to wait. This marked how the Leakin army issue was resolved. Afterward, Hilda and Raphael, who had remained silent during the journey, returned home safely. At present, a dwarf holds a target and asks His Majesty to aim at it, stating that this is the original power of the musket. Alan asks if they had merely altered the damage inflicted in automatic fire mode. The dwarf agrees, saying it was the same musket Alan had used before. Alan quickly fires at the target using a divine shot, and the dwarves remark how incredible His Majesty is, while Blorg comments that it's as if the equipment has a life of its own. Alan reflects that he feels more and more familiarity with the weapons he knows, and when he uses his divine energy, he can change the weapon's structure itself. Blorg suggests that Alan should pray to maintain his divine power, ensuring he has ammunition ready to use. and asks if he also plans to enhance his body with divine power, while Alan thinks about his skeletons. Blord begins to discuss armor but is interrupted by another dwarf who calls His Highness, saying the preparations are complete and Hilda is summoning him. Alan inquires about his sister, while Blorg says he has a gift for Alan, so he can take it with him, as they have prepared the festival especially for him. Hilda raises a glass of wine, saying good work to everyone, drinking the glass immediately after, and declaring that the blood festival will now begin. A tomato hits someone. Alan reflects that the festival consists of avoiding bad luck by throwing tomatoes as if they were real blood. Alan remarks that it resembled the tomato festival from his past life but then notices something surprising. He sees the members of the Crusades, noting that they seem to be having fun too. However, they question why they are still wearing their cloaks, joking about being dismissed if they remove them even for a moment. A tomato is thrown and hits Alan squarely in the face. The culprit is Alice. The civilians behind Alan gasp in shock, and Alice apologizes profusely to His Highness. She explains she was playing with the children, and this wasn't her intention. But Alan takes the tomato from his face and says it's delicious. He assures Alice it's fine and that she should continue enjoying herself. He reflects that, considering his past, he probably deserved to be hit with the fruit. Alice stammers slightly and tries to talk to the prince. She suggests they sit down and share a drink together, leaving Alan questioning her suggestion. Alice says she wants to learn more about the resurrection magic Alan performed. Alan replies that there's nothing more to say on the matter. He explains it was an idea based on injecting divine power to capture a soul leaving the body. Raphael watches from a distance. Alan grabs a drink from a waiter, saying it's all thanks to Alice. He notes she was one of the people treating his brother, handing her a beer. He praises her as an incredible healer who didn't give up until the end. Alice smiles at Alan while looking at the drink. She says she knows it's late, but she thanks him for his help at the palace and for assisting in Hilda's territory. The townspeople cheer, shouting that the monsters are gone and that the prince, princess, and archbishop deserve applause. Alan reflects that it isn't as noisy as before, and he even misses the people he left behind. Looking to the side, he wonders if Charlotte and Harmon are doing well. Blood drips onto the ground as heavy breathing is heard. Charlotte lies on the ground, bloodied, clutching her sword. Someone taunts her, asking if that's all she's got. It's Oscar Balvers, 84 years old, the vice commander of the Golden Crusade, who calls Charlotte a puppet hiding behind the name Hermes. Charlotte rises, recalling the king's words. He had told her to follow him as he would introduce her to Oscar. The king had mentioned hearing she was training in Humite, and hoped Oscar would appreciate his extended vacation. He explained that Oscar was the vice commander of the Golden Crusade, a fighter against Amon's legion, and known as the King of the Sword. Charlotte repeats the title, King of the Sword. Celtic nods at her. He says he hopes it's a valuable experience for her. Charlotte hurrays. Oscar acknowledges Charlotte's sharpened skills. He asks what she wants. He comments on her persistence, carrying a name that isn't even hers. Charlotte declares that she seeks power. Oscar inquires what she would do with power, and she responds that she wishes to serve and protect the seventh prince. Oscar challenges her, asking what she would do if the prince perished. Charlotte answers that her life exists solely for him, and that she would sacrifice herself for him if she could. Then he asks her what she would do if ordered to kill the seventh prince. Charlotte hesitates, saying that's. Oscar calls her a naive child. He explains that they are puppets, and if a member of the imperial family orders them, they must obey without question, even if the order is to kill their own master, as their words are absolute, and Charlotte cannot doubt that. Charlotte declares that she has never doubted him. Raising her sword, she adds, however, she could never harm His Highness. Oscar dismisses her words as nonsense, asserting that she understands the gravity of what he's saying. He vows to train her to become an imperial puppet. He prepares his scythe, telling Hermes to come at him again. Charlotte defends against the blow. Their strikes collide with a resounding impact. Luan is in his room with a young woman. He mentions hearing something and asks the two women, one of whom confirms that she also heard it, and it's getting closer. They all pause to listen. The door bursts open, revealing Alan Alphals. Pointing his weapon at Luan, he announces to his dear brother that he's back. He says he arrived earlier than expected just so he could shoot him, causing the women to flee. Luan, unfazed, says he's happy to see his brother in such good health, but Alan tells him not to worry as he prepares his shot, noting that divine power is good for the body, which strikes Luan, who says he didn't expect to be hit like that. Luan complains, holding his head, asking if Alan thought it wasn't excessive to shoot his own older brother. However, Alan says not to be a crybaby, as his body wasn't actually hurt thanks to the divine power, though Luan might feel a little pain from the high density of divine energy hitting him all at once, and he tells Luan not to exaggerate. Luan admits he's made mistakes like Alan and suggests they call it even, welcoming his younger brother, who responds by saying Luan already knew that. He adds that, in any case, as Luan knew, he planned to hide in the palace labyrinth for a while. Luan asks why he'd do that, suggesting he could just stay in the city for a time, but Alan refuses, saying he didn't know what was wrong with the Archbishop. But ever since Alan returned, Raphael kept calling him, always asking if Alan had considered learning magic under Raphael Astoria. However, Alan firmly rejects the idea, even surprising the Archbishop. Alan explains that Raphael kept making the same offer repeatedly, and Alan was tired and wanted to hide from him. Luan explains it's because Raphael wants Alan, as he is the best magic researcher, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to learn from him. But Alan says he doesn't want to and won't even consider it, insisting he can learn as much magic as he wants from magical books. However, a servant arrives at the door and informs Luan that he's delivering an update. Alan thinks about trying to hide, but he's sure the old man will eventually find him. The butler states that the matter with the Black Order is becoming increasingly urgent, surprising Alan. Alan questions what the Black Order is, and Luan asks if he has heard about it too. Luan explains that they were discovered once where Alan captured Morgana, the witch, and they're now being found in Humite. His Majesty is paying more attention because many people live there. However, it's a major headache since necromancers are involved, prompting Alan to ask about it, mentioning he gained a lot of knowledge about necromancy after reading Morgana's book and wondering if that's related. Alan asks what they do with the books after capturing necromancers, and Luan says they don't keep dangerous things like that in the castle. Some are destroyed as soon as they're found, while others are stored in the basement of the academy in Humite. Alan imagines a scenario in the palace where Raphael insists on taking him as a disciple, and he runs away, saying Raphael has gone mad. In his imagination of Humite, he envisions access to numerous references in books, weaker necromancers than monsters, and a comfortable life alone. He then offers something to his brother, who asks what it is. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.